Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Marshal Ophir McKnight climbed down from his horse and began to pick through the eerily silent camp. The travelers had picked a prime spot back away from the trail, beside the creek that shared his given name. They had picketed their horses and built a small fire with a cook pot over it. The camp had all the markings of a family that was moving further west. From the location of their camp, he figured they were out of Reno and headed southwest toward either Carson City or more likely one of the smaller mining and logging towns on the shore of Lake Tahoe, probably Lunam. He'd called to the camp several times before entering it, but the only answer he got was from a whinnying of the horses as they complained of being too long on the picket line. Taking off his hat, he looked toward the east where the sun was just peeking over Mount Rose. Something felt wrong here, terribly wrong. These people should have been stirring long before now. They were less than a day's travel to Lunam or even Crystal Bay. He sniffed at the air and then winced. Hidden deep under the wood smoke, animal and scorched coffee smells, there was a pungent odor of an open grave. Thumbing the hammer thong on the Colt 1878 he wore on his hip, he called again, "Hello, the camp!" His only answer was the calls of the morning birds and the buzzing of insects. Carefully, he began searching the camp, looking for signs of life. A quick glance inside the wagon told him all he needed to know. 4 human shapes were cocooned inside wooden army blankets, unmoving, and there was the stench of death and the grave about them. It set his stomach to churning. Holding back the bile that threatened his throat, he searched the inside of the wagon, careful not to touch the cocoons. He found a doll appropriate for a young girl and a small boy's hat. Double-checking the cocoons, he realized that there were at least 2 forms missing, and that was not a good sign. Climbing down from the wagon, he studied the dun-colored dry soil. There didn't seem to be any signs of trouble. He quickly identified at least 8 different sets of footprints, 2 of which came directly into the camp and then left in the same direction. Intrigued, he studied them for a moment. One of the prints were male boots, expensive riding boots like he remembered wearing as a young lad way back a lifetime ago in Mobile. Not what one would expect in the rugged Sierra Nevada mountains. The other set looked like working boots. He squatted next to the prints and ran his fingers just above their outline. Then, bending down further, he first flared his nostrils and then breathed in deeply. Again there was an overwhelming odor of dead flesh and an open grave and not much else. Retrieving his horse, he followed the prints down to the creek and could see where they turned north to follow its banks and not crossing it. Entering a pine thicket, he suddenly caught a whiff of blood and death. Instantly going on the alert, he looked around but saw nothing. He carefully picked his way through the thicket, following his nose. Perhaps 50 yards into the copse of trees, the steady buzzing sound of flies caught his attention. Looking up, he saw what at first he thought was a black mass of leaves, but soon realized it was a small human form draped over a low limb. A tiny bare foot was hanging from the bottom of the mass of flies. Looking around the area, he saw another mass of crawling insects on the ground. This time, only the small hand of a boy was visible. Fear steeled his mind as he climbed down from the saddle and tethered his horse. With a quick leap and scramble, he climbed the tree with ease. Reaching the mass of flies covering the small body, he began to shoo them away with his hat until he could see the form of a young girl of about 4 years. Her body had been shoved into the fork of a limb. Her little neck was at an odd angle, and he could see where something had torn out most of her throat. Gently he removed the body and scrambled down the tree and lay her on the soft pine needles. Then he turned his attention to the other mass, only to find the boy of about the same age. His neck, too, had been broken, and his throat ripped out, but his body had fared somewhat the worse for wear on the ground, where small animals could get to it. Ophir's soul raged at the thought of innocent blood being spilled so casually. He could feel the beast that resided in his soul begin to stir and pace. As his temper grew, so did the agitation of the beast, and now he had an idea of what he was dealing with. Placing the bodies across his saddle, he covered them with a blanket and led his horse out of the trees and back up toward the camp, knowing what he had to do. He found a shovel tied to the side of the wagon and set out digging 2 large pits in the ground. It was nearly noon when he was finished with that part, and he'd worked up a powerful thirst, a thirst he slaked from the water of the creek. Then, spreading some dry tinder at the bottom of each pit, he began to build a pyre made of wood from the surrounding trees. Double-checking his work to ensure that it would burn hot enough to do what he needed without getting out of hand, he worked well into mid-afternoon. Checking the sky periodically, he watched the sun begin to slip lower into the horizon. He had to hurry, because sundown would make things far worse. When he was finished with that, he took a hatchet and sharpened 4 stakes he'd cut from a nearby rowan tree. Then came the hard part. Pulling the tarp from the wagon, he climbed up inside the first figure cocooned in the woolen blankets. Picking it up, he hopped down next to the pits, and with the stake in one hand, he rolled the form out of its blanket. The woman's flesh was pale, thin and nearly translucent, showing the outlines of the veins beneath it. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with long blonde hair. He could see her eyes flicker back and forth under the white flesh of her eyelids. She cried a mournful wail of pain and sorrow that echoed across the valley. Still mostly asleep, the pitiful thing that had once been a woman, a wife, and a mother, began to writhe and crawl toward the shadow of the wagon as its skin blistered and burned in the afternoon sunlight. Ophir stepped over it and drove the stake through its heart with a single thrust. Then, with the shovel he used to dig the pits, he separated her head from the body. Chunk! The burning and blistering stopped immediately, and the face suddenly had a peaceful countenance upon it. As he would expect, there was no blood in the body. He then gently lay the head on one pyre, and the body upon the next. He repeated the process 3 more times before laying the body of the children upon the pyres. Saying a prayer to whatever god might listen, he set the pyres ablaze. Normally, such a fire would not burn long or hot enough to reduce the bodies to ashes, but he stood there staring into the blaze, calling up the witcheries his father, his mother, his grandmother, and even his great-grandmother had taught him. Pouring his will into the flame, he watched as it grew hotter. He watched it burn orange at first, and then red, and finally white-hot, as he stood there making sure the souls of at least this family could find rest. It would not rest until he had found for them. The beast in his soul demanded no less. Cain Mortar lugged the last heavy box down the steps into the old Shipton house and looked around at his work. 5 heavy wooden boxes that made Cain think uncomfortably of coffins lay scattered around the old root cellar, each one nailed shut. It had been hot and thirsty work, bringing them halfway up the mountainside to this old house that some foreigner had paid good money to buy. They then turned around and spent more good money to have that sick lawyer Dickerson hire a bunch of carpenters to come here and fix up the place. Cain Mortar was not a man accustomed to hard work, and to be honest, something Mortar avoided whenever possible. If he hadn't been desperate, he'd not have taken the job when it was offered to him by Dickerson. But Mortar was broke, and the pay was good. $3 for half a day's work to haul them boxes out there, put them in the root cellar, and lock up behind them. That was twice what he could expect out of the silver mine in a whole week of pay for nothing with one of the logging gangs. Couldn't beat that with a stick. Dusting his hands off, he noticed the sun begin to dip behind the western mountains of the Carson Range. A chill went down his spine as he watched the reds and orange and purples flare across the darkening sky, making it appear as if it was bleeding. Shrugging it off to the unexpectedly cool temperatures for September that they'd been having, he turned back and went back down the stairs to the heavy wooden table and lit the kerosene lamp there. Outside, the wind began to pick up, and he heard the sharp bang of a loose shutter against the side of the house. The old place had been abandoned since the Shiptons had all up and died from the flu that came through about 2 years ago. They were buried out in the family plot, and nobody ever visited them. Wait, he seemed to have heard a voice at the edge of his hearing. It was as much a command as it was a request. Cain looked around the room to see who'd spoken, only to find nothing but the boxes sitting peaceably on the hard dirt floor. He glanced over at the lamp, and something about how the fire danced across the wick caught his attention. For long moments he simply stood there, staring at it as it leapt and danced under the chimney like some fiery imp from hell. He didn't know how long he'd stood there, mesmerized by it, but when he finally looked up, the lengthening shadows had stretched into the eerie twilight of dusk. Shaking his head, he cursed himself for not paying attention to the time and reached for the lamp. Bam! The light in the lamp fluttered and made the shadows dance along the wall in time with the leaping flame as the door leading out of the cellar slammed shut. Feeling his heart pound in his chest, Cain grabbed the lamp and headed up the short pine stairs to the heavy gray doors. He pushed at them, but they were locked from the outside. A man-shaped shadow flashed across the slits between the gray, weathered planks. "Hey! Let me out of here!" Cain demanded. "Wait." Again the voice, at the edge of his hearing, said. A strange stillness came over the man that was Cain Mortar, and he found himself unable to move his feet. A small scratching came from behind him. He turned to investigate, only to see a bony hand reach out from under the lid of one of the boxes. Cain found himself mesmerized while the horrific form that pushed back the lid of the box emerged with the stillness of the dead. It was tall, thin, with a hooked nose and eyes that reflected the fiery red flames of hell. Bushy steel gray eyebrows were the foundation of a forehead that arched up into a thick head of hair of the same shade. A long mustache and a small pointed beard framed the cruel mouth with the thin lips and sharp canines. The tips of his ears came to fine points, and he was dressed in a kind of suit Cain expected of rich dandies back east. It was all black, including his shirt, and the only bit of color about him was a small red pin on his tie. Some part of Cain's brain was screaming to run, to get the hell out of there, but his fate refused to budge as the man drew closer, seeming to glide across the floor without taking a single step. Cain's heart pounded in his chest as the man approached and smiled cruelly, displaying the pair of long, wolf-like fangs on either side of his upper teeth. Cain felt his body tremble as the man touched the side of his face with a cold, dead hand. This terrible sucking sound began to fill the room. Some part of Cain's mind screamed out in terror. It was well into the night when the deed was done. The family's belongings had been fed to the fire, like in the traditions of the ancient Vikings. 6 crosses marked the pit where he had burned the bodies of the family, before spreading their ashes in the creek below. Ophir didn't know their names, but the family Bible was for the Vordenberg family, so that was the name he put on the largest cross. He waited in the night, his own thoughts troubled by what he'd seen and done. Ophir had grown up in a Witchkin family, and had been taught by both his grandmother, Mary Beaumere, and his great-grandmother, Catherine MacNaughton, née Dubois, but various other Witchkin, so he had known what to do to destroy the things in the wagon. The question was, could he find the undead responsible for this before it spread so wide that it would take a miracle to stop it? Feeding and watering the 2 horses of the Vordenberg family, as well as his own, he sat back against his saddle and waited, his .45, his Henry, and his father's cavalry saber near at hand. He expected to have visitors again tonight, as he expected that the one responsible for what had happened to this family to come and check on their work. It was just a few hours before sunrise when he saw something gliding silently through the trees, disturbing not a single leaf or pine needle. It was tall and thin, and wore a tin star on its vest and a 6-shooter on its hip, and did not expect to be seen as it circled the campsite to see what had become of its kill. In life, this man had been middle-aged, lean, and weathered by the elements. Evidently, he'd been the town sheriff somewhere nearby. In death, he was a washed-out image of his former self, and had now taken to hunting travelers. Finally, deciding on the direct approach, the creature stepped out of the trees and called, "Hello, the camp!" Ophir smiled to himself and thought, "There's one." He did not, however, answer. "Hello, the camp!" The creature called again. "There's 2. Just one more." "Hello, the camp!" The creature called out a 3rd time. Ophir noted the sound of disappointment in its voice. "Hello?" Ophir answered on the 3rd call. "Who are you, and what do you want?" "I'm Sheriff Plant from Lunam, and I'm looking for a missing family." "Oh, really?" he asked. "Family got a name?" Ophir watched the creature struggle for a name. Finally it said, "Jones." Ophir smiled and told him, "Haven't met anybody named Jones on the trail, and I came all the way from Carson City." "You got a name?" "I do." "Care to give it to me?" "Ask me again," Ophir answered. "What's your name?" it finally asked, once again disappointed. "Ophir McKnight, U.S. Marshal," he told him. Of course, that was only the name that Ophir had been using since he left Bontreville, after the unfortunate events that had shattered his family. He, his Uncle Teddy, and his grandmother all agreed that perhaps it was time for the McNaughton name to sleep for a while, so Ophir had changed it to McKnight, which is what McNaughton meant anyway. "Can I come into the camp, Marshal?" the creature asked, holding up its hands. "If you can," he replied. And again the man asked, "Can I come into the camp?" "If you can," Ophir repeated. "You're not being very hospitable," the sheriff complained. "Perhaps," Ophir told him, rising to his feet. His left hand concealed the saber behind his back, his right hovering over his .45. "Dangerous times." "You're so right," the creature growled. With lightning reflexes, the thing, masquerading as Sheriff Plant, drew its pistol and fired. Ophir hit the ground rolling and came up firing his Colt twice, while the sheriff cocked his for a second shot. The first bullet ripped through the sheriff's chest. The second, however, caught him right between the eyes and blew out the back of his brain case. The vampire hit the ground, having never gotten off his second shot. Moving quickly before the vampire could put itself back together, Ophir stepped in and hacked through the back of its neck with a saber until its head rolled away. This time the vampire began to crumble to dust in the cool night air. Ophir watched as the ashes and dust mingled in the rising heat from his campfire and sparked like lightning bugs rising in the night sky. Shaking his head, he couldn't help but think about the waste. He knew the sheriff was not going to be the last undead he was going to encounter. He knew that there was a second vampire out there, probably the one that made the sheriff. He could already feel the pull of the arcane, and it was coming from the direction of the town of Lunam. The beast in his soul growled at the thought.
Let me set the scene for you. The room is dark, enclosed, underground. The floor is smooth stone, chalked with a dizzying array of strange symbols, all arranged in a careful pattern. They form the idea of a cage, an idea so strong that it's almost visible. The walls are lined with bookshelves, heavy with paraphernalia. Leather-bound books, thick crucibles, strange artifacts, and more. Everything is carefully placed. This is not the casual collection one might find in a standard home. It is clear that each object on these shelves holds meaning and use. There is no dust on anything. It is all regularly used and meticulously cared for. At one end of the room, adding flourishes to the symbols on the floor, is a man in a sober black suit. His name is Michaelis, and he is an evoker. He is the preeminent magician of his time. He is nearly good enough for what he is about to attempt. For years, Michaelis has worked to perfect his craft. Other magicians may be content with a few small tricks, abandoning their study of magic as soon as they have achieved the wealth or status they desire. For Michaelis, though, the magic is the point. He needs wealth only to fund his research, status only to gain access to the books and tools he seeks. Material possessions do not interest him. He gathers magical power for the sole purpose of being able to gain still more. Already, he is the strongest sorcerer the world has seen in centuries. Still, he thirsts for more. Tonight, he believes, will be his greatest achievement yet. It is the result of over 5 years of work. Starting from only the merest fragment of a burned book, he has recreated a summoning spell not seen in thousands of years. His work has been immensely thorough, for he understands the dangers involved. The entity this spell conjures could incinerate the globe in an instant. It could alter the path of stars, unmake prophecies, reach through time itself to effect its will. It is, as a rule, barred from our universe, kept out by protections far more ancient than humanity. But this spell weakens those protections enough to allow it to reach through. Under Michaelis's direction, it will be a potent tool, an amazing advancement in his abilities. It has been bound before and can be again. The spell details the steps, the symbols, the sacrifices. Every incantation Michaelis has practiced, drawing upon the knowledge of the dead to confirm his syllables. Every line he has sketched over and over until he can draw them flawlessly, perfectly replicating what was laid out in the reconstituted book. The scene is set. The cage is prepared. The sacrifice is bound and waiting. All is exactly as the book described. The book, alas, has an imperceptible flaw. Michaelis, unknowing, begins the ritual. His voice flows through the wavering notes of the forgotten language. The air thickens and sparks around him. The resonance of the words pours into the chalked symbols. The lines funnel the power to its proper place. The entire space begins to glow with a color unknown to humanity, unknown to reality. It is the shape of the world separating. It is the vision of a reality beyond our own. This color pours through the gap like syrup, puddling and filling the cage of imagination. It is not what Michaelis has summoned. It is merely a space in which the being he calls upon can exist. The words of the spell cascade forth from the evoker, almost coming of their own volition now. The symbols on the floor dance with light, flashing out a demanding pattern, a call that must be answered. And within the space, within the blister of anti-reality, something calls back. Michaelis speaks its true name. He fixes it into place, compelling it to heed his command. As long as his sacrifice is accepted, it must acquiesce to his desire. The thing within the cage inhales deeply, a Charybdian inrush of air. The life is sucked from the sacrifice, and it is here that the book has led Michaelis astray. The symbol that was inked in the book had a single, vital, extra line. This changed the meaning from sacrifice, singular, and directed, to sacrifices, open-ended, unbounded. Michaelis drops even as the intended sacrifice also goes limp. He is dead before he ever has the opportunity to understand his error. Still, the thing in the cage breathes in, drawing forth all that the sacrifices have to give. It takes their lives, their memories, their potential. It takes their hope and their love and their regret. It sucks out every last bit they have to offer before discarding their husks. The bodies crumble apart, too brittle to sustain their own weight. Finally, anchored and aware, the being takes in its surroundings. It smiles as it comprehends the fate of the one that called it. It presses forward, testing the boundaries of its prison, but aside from the one fatal flaw, the spell was perfect. Nothing from its reality can cross the walls constructed here, and until the being is dismissed, it cannot return to its own plane. With the caster dead, it is trapped eternally, unable to go forward or back. Yet, a loophole exists. The being banishes the material of its reality back through the tear, stands naked and exposed in the painful mundanity of our world. Nothing of its nature could pass through the walls before it, but it is powerful enough even to recreate its own self. It imagines itself slow, weak, bound by restrictions and natural laws. It strips away its magnificence, its terrible beauty, its awe-inducing splendor, and remakes itself in the image of the impossibly limited beings of this realm. So reduced, it steps lightly through the walls of imagination. They are no longer any impediment, for it is no longer what it was. There is the tiniest of sparks within it yet, a piece small enough to slip through the laws of reality. But for all intents and purposes, its true self has been shorn completely away, leaving only me. I entered this world fully formed, with complete knowledge of what I had once been and no way to access my previous power. I had access only to the magic wielded by the evoker who had summoned me, an amount so paltry that he could barely even bend local space. The spark in my belly burned, demanded that I find and consume more power so that I might again be what I once was. Michaelis had thought himself driven by the search for power, but his need was merely academic. I literally hungered for it. Like a slow-moving blaze, I devoured his library. Gemstones crunched between my teeth, artifacts snapped in my hands, reduced to pieces small enough to swallow. I inhaled greedily as I broke them, catching the wisps of magic that escaped. They were nothing, like sucking on candy wrappers to get the flavor. I pressed on, hoping for something of value in this collection. I tore pages from their bindings and stuffed them into my mouth, ripping and chewing through thick vellum and brittle parchment with equal ease. Busy fingers tore leather bindings into jerky-like strips, and I swallowed those too. Millennia of knowledge were lost from the world, and still I felt no better. These dabblings did not begin to address my deep-seated need, though they were the best humanity had to offer. If magic was a lake, then humans were the bugs crawling across the top, unable to break the surface tension. Unaware that other things swam in its depths, things that would gladly rise up and swallow them whole, and that those things in turn were food for the true predators. I was the fisherman, trying to subsist on the food that the bugs found filling. It could never work. I needed fish. I knew spells to call them up. Michaelis had been a smarter bug than most, able at least to peer into the lake. But I needed a sacrifice. More, to continue within the metaphor, bait. That was easy enough to obtain. I uttered a short transportation spell to step from the basement to a nearby city street. A young couple walking by caught my eye. I called out to them. "Excuse me?" They turned, their eyes widened. "Do you need help?" asked the man. "Yes, I'm in need of a sacrifice. Would you come with me?" What? Why are you naked?" I waved my hand, glamoring myself to appear neatly clad. "Oh, absurd. You must have been mistaken. Will you come with me, please?" His jaw hung slightly open as his mind concluded that what he had seen made no sense, and therefore discarded it. A sacrifice? I don't... I twisted his mind, modifying his desires. He continued without missing a beat. "See, why not? Let's go." The woman with him squeaked in shock. "You can't!" I removed him from her memories. As a kindness, I took him entirely away. She would never remember him, no matter what others told her, and so she would never mourn him. I am merciful when it suits me. She blinked at us briefly, uncertain what she had been saying or why, then turned and walked away. Clasping my sacrifice by the shoulder, I spoke the word of returning. The street around us vanished, replaced by the empty shelves of the underground room. "If you'll just kneel right there, please," I told the man I'd taken. He did as I directed, eagerly waiting in his place as I altered key components of the chalked circle to bring up what I wanted. I did not need anything big. Reduced as I was, I did not even want anything big. What I needed was something small, easily handled, easily consumed. I let the words of evocation roll off of my tongue. They clotted together in the runes of the circle, thickening the lines until the entire shape glowed. My sacrifice died with a smile on his face, excited to be doing his part even as the spell ate him alive. The creature I summoned was a sprite of this plane, a minor entity with no real power. It far outstripped the simple magics of the humans, though, and I fell upon it greedily as it arrived. With tongue and tail and talons, I tore it to pieces and crammed them into my gullet. It shrieked as I ripped it apart, but the fear only added seasoning to the snack. In moments, the deed was done. I licked my lips, enjoying the lingering taste. My summoning had been fresh, rich, and delicious compared to the sad scraps of the library, but it did more to sharpen my appetite than to sate it. I began to speak the transportation spell again, but a wave of wariness washed over me. To my dismay, I realized I had overexerted myself. I was so used to having infinite potential that although I knew that was not the case in my lessened form, I had not thought to account for it. I was, of course, aware of the concept of limitations. They had simply never applied to me before. I made my way back upstairs to McKellis's living space. I prepared food for myself, then laid down to sleep in his bed. I dreamed a nightmare of shackles and bondage, of vital necessities dangling in sight, but out of reach. I woke in a cold sweat. The goosebumps on my skin stood in stark contrast to the insistent fire burning inside of me. It demanded that I find more power, that I restore myself to my full and awful glory. It gripped me like an addiction. I had no choice but to obey. I needed a better technique. In such a frail body, I would never be able to summon entities of enough strength to satisfy my need. I would spend nearly all of my time sleeping to recover and waking to find myself ever more ravenous. It would form a loop from which I would never escape. Fortunately, McKellis's memories held the answer. He knew of a place where a creature ran wild, a house possessed by a spirit. It was perfect. I would not have to expend any energy summoning it. It was already here. All I would have to do was corral it. I nearly began the transportation spell before I remembered that I was attempting to conserve energy. It was possible that McKellis had exaggerated the abilities of this creature in his memory. It would not do to spend as much power on travel as I gained from consumption. Instead, I called up a cab and waited for it to arrive. I do not think I had ever waited for anything in my eternal life before. It was not, I found, an entirely unpleasant experience. I was able to reflect, to consider, to plan instead of simply reacting. Planning had never been in my nature, but then again, I left my nature behind when I entered this reality. It was time to develop a new self. The cab driver dropped me off next to the dingy for sale sign next to the house. Smaller signs hung below the name of the brokerage, extolling the reduced price and the motivated sellers. Despite these, it looked like the house had been on the market for quite some time. "A realtor meeting you here?" the cabbie asked as I exited. "You want me to wait until he gets here?" "No, I'll be fine," I said. I paid the man using actual money, neither trick nor forgery. I found the experience refreshing, play acting at being human. I was in good spirits. Even from the street, I could feel the malevolence of the house. Something dark squatted within, something with the power I needed. The hunger inside me growled. It sensed the meal soon to come. The front door should have been locked, but it swung open as soon as I touched the knob. I could feel the house's anticipation. It wanted visitors. It was calling me in, practically dragging me across the threshold. I smiled. It was nice to be invited. I stepped inside. The front room was spacious, well lit and pleasantly appointed. The canary yellow walls put me in mind of a bright, hopeful sunrise. It was warm and comforting, and I pretended not to notice that the door I had entered through had disappeared. I continued into the house, entering a wood-floored dining room. This too seemed nice at first glance, but as I glanced around, I began to spot subtle indicators that all was not well. There were scratches on the floor that looked as if something had clawed its way out of the vent, or as if someone had been dragged against their will into it. There was a scorch mark in the corner that had not been fully scrubbed away, showing that something had burned there. Looking at it, I felt as if I could hear distant weeping. I moved on to the kitchen. The wallpaper here was a busy pattern that did not quite manage to hide the spots of mold. The grout in between the tiles on the floor was cracked and blackened. The clock on the wall ticked in sync with my heartbeat. The room seemed to breathe as I did, growing imperceptibly larger and smaller. I felt anxiety settle over me like a net. A person might have thought the feeling their own and begun to panic, feeding it. I, on the other hand, seized the psychic strands and yanked. I felt a sharp surprise from the far end, then a skittering sensation as the emotion tried to squirm through my fingers. I clenched my hands and wrapped the invisible threads around my fists, refusing to relinquish my grasp. The thing occupying the house was not bright. It had its little tricks, but when they failed to work, it had nothing to do but try them again. It doubled down on the decay, hoping to frighten me into letting go. The wallpaper peeled around me, the cabinets warped and sagged open, ants and maggots drooled from the openings, spilling onto the counters in confused disarray. The clock's tick sped up, dragging my heartbeat along with it. The tiles cracked under my feet, tumbling away to reveal treacherous holes into the basement below. I laughed and hauled on the strings I had caught once more. They pulled free with a visceral rip, like flaying skin from a deer. The thing in the house screamed. I felt its pain and dread wash over me. I reveled in it. I thrust my hands into the peeling wallpaper, bypassing the actuality of the house to seize the infestation within. I grabbed a double fistful of something slimy and pustulant and drew it forth. A thick bubble rose from the wall, fighting me every inch of the way. I plunged my face into it and bit down. It was ripe and juicy on my tongue, and its fear was delicious. The bubble popped, leaving me holding a thick, fleshy strip torn from the mind of the creature. The kitchen snapped back to normal. I could sense the thing fleeing, abandoning the house it had possessed to a superior force. Unfortunately for it, I had not come for half measures. I raced it to the front room, where the door had reappeared, and snatched that portal away again. The invisible thing slammed into the wall, its egress denied. Snarling and trapped, it turned back on me. The door buckled and broke under my feet. The yellow walls raged like a forest fire, waves of heat billowing forth. The air turned to a choking miasma and filled the sounds of screams. I gathered it all in, absorbing it as fast as it came. Everything it threw at me only fed me, making me stronger even as it was ripped apart. Periodically, it turned to flee, but I chased it relentlessly, tearing windows and doors out of its grasp. Each new wave of its attacks was weaker, more desperate. Each one left it with less and less of itself remaining. Finally, it was nothing but a mewling thing in the corner of the attic. I towered over it, enjoying its abject surrender and utter terror. I picked it up, cradled it in the palm of my hand, and popped it into my mouth. The final bite tasted like triumph. I ran my tongue sensually over my lips, enjoying the new feeling of strength within myself. I was not remotely satiated, not anywhere close to what I had once been, but I was more than I was an hour before, and I was riding high on the thrill of the chase. I sauntered outside, leaving behind me an unblemished, untainted, utterly normal suburban house. As I pondered where to go next, my eye fell on the weathered real estate sign. A delightful idea popped into my mind. I spoke a few words and found myself outside of the headquarters of the agency selling the once-possessed house. I gave a pleasant wave as I passed the receptionist and entered the office of Oliver Daniels, the agent whose name had been on the sign. Can I help you?" he asked, looking up from a pile of paperwork. "I have excellent news," I informed him. "That house you've been unable to sell, you'll find it is now free of issues." His brow furrowed. "Sorry, are you a seller? Which house are you talking about?" "You know which house. The one that was haunted?" His face blanched. "There's no such thing." "Not anymore, no. Not for that house. I have resolved the issue. Would you like to come look?" He turned whiter still. I wondered briefly if he was about to pass out. No, if you say so, it's... You're sure it's safe now?" "Completely," I assured him. I was very thorough. He breathed out a long sigh. A bit of color returned to his face, though his eyes were still wide. "I was in there, for days. I don't know how I got out. I was just on the porch one day. The door opened behind me. I had my freedom. I could see my car, and yet I turned to walk back inside. A neighbor saw me, ran over to get me before I could go back in. If it hadn't been for them, I would have. I tried to take the sign down, but somehow it kept getting put up again. I even burned it one time, but it was there in the yard just a day later. Every once in a while, a new client will ask about the house, and every time I can feel it calling me back. This is the first time in months I've been able to think about the house without feeling an urge to go there. You really did it, didn't you? You really took care of it." I really did. Tears welled up in his eyes. "Thank you. Oh my God. Thank you so much. Anything I can do for you, ever, let me know." I smiled. I took a business card from his desk and ran the nail of one finger over it. I handed it to him. "This is my card." Gray Michael, he read, the name I had put in place of his own. He blinked at the card. "You work here? Just down the hall. The next time you find a problem like this, just come knock." I'll do that. And do let others know as well. I do like to keep busy. I left his office and moved a short way down the hall. At a convenient spot of blank wall, I pressed an extra space into the building, a room that did not properly fit within its dimensions. I opened the solid wooden door to reveal an office with an imposing desk, a comfortable chair, several tall bookcases, and a large pictured window. I smiled as I closed the door behind me, feeling it vanish from the wall of the real estate agency. It would be there when it was needed. For now, it was time to get settled in my new domain. I had plans to make. That was quite some time ago. These days, rather an array of business cards bear my name, and a startling number of overlooked doors open into my office. I sit in my chair, practice my smile, and listen as voices whisper my name. Gray Michael. It's nice to be needed. And really, the work is its own reward.
It's 7:35 p.m., May 27th. The incomparable Sheriff Ron Ball and the stalwart Deputy Ernest Dingle on duty.
Unit 1, we got a 1070 at the Royalty Deluxe Luxury Mobile Estates. I repeat, a 1070. Unit 1, do you copy?
Sheriff Ron Ball looked at Dingle. No more than 5 minutes after they'd parked for a little snack, and here comes a 1070.
What's a 1070?
Dingle asked.
Prowler. Some sick son of a bitch with idle hands and a hard-on decides to go skulking around.
Unit 1, do you copy?
Ball fingered the button on his radio.
Say, Frankie, why do you always gotta call me Unit 1 when you know damn well there ain't no Unit 2 or 3 or anyone else?
Sorry, Sheriff, just following protocol is all. Trailer 17. It's supposed to be a 1070 in progress, sir.
Following protocol. Now, ain't that a fanciful idea? Problem is, Frankie, the deputy and I are currently responding to a 7-Eleven.
A pause.
A 7-Eleven, sir? I'm unfamiliar.
It means we're having a couple of hot dogs by the 7-Eleven. They never taught you that one in dispatch class?
Another pause.
Lady of the house says there's some fella hanging around outside, sir. Supposed to be peeping in the window while she's in the bathroom.
Good heavens.
Dingle said.
That's not nice.
No, deputy, that's not nice at all. If it were, they wouldn't have a radio code for it.
Why do you suppose that is? Never have a radio code for no one doing nothing nice.
Besides a 7-Eleven, anyways.
Yeah, you're right about that, Sheriff. It sure is nice having a 7-Eleven.
Unit 1, do you copy?
Go ahead.
It appears the suspect is still on scene, caught up somehow. Something about being stuck in a toilet bowl, sir.
A toilet bowl?
Ball said.
You mean the suspect got inside?
Negative. The toilet bowl is supposed to be outside, Sheriff.
Well, I'd have to disagree with that.
Dingle said.
The toilet bowl is most certainly supposed to be inside.
No, I think what Frankie is trying to say, deputy, is that this particular one just happens to be outside.
Oh, well, that makes sense.
Unit 1, do you copy?
10-4, Frankie. The deputy and I are on our way.
Ball frowned at his half-eaten hot dog.
You want to finish this, deputy?
Dingle recoiled at the suggestion.
Well, I can't eat after you, Sheriff. I could catch the Ronavirus.
Well, goddamn.
Sheriff Ball tossed his hot dog out the window and hit the cherries. Then they pulled out onto the road. Royalty Deluxe Luxury Mobile Estates was only a mile down the interstate. I happen to live there, but that's besides the point. Ball cut the siren and they pulled into the gravel entrance. Illuminated in the strobing lights as they approached Trailer 17 was the unmistakable figure of a man in distress. As described, he had one foot on the ground and the other one in a toilet bowl. By the flowers and dirt scattered around it, the commode had clearly been used as a planter. The tank still had tomatoes dangling out of it. Ball left the lights on and stepped out of the cruiser. Dingle followed. The man's eyes glowed in the lights like a raccoon's caught in a dumpster. An Indian feller, complete with the turban thing you sometimes see 'em wearing. Not the usual kind of feller you see around here. Then again, it wasn't a usual thing to see a fella with his foot in a toilet bowl either, particularly outdoors. All in all, there was nothing usual about it.
Evening,
Ball said.
Say, you happen to notice anyone prowling around here tonight? There's supposed to have been someone sneaking around, peeking in windows at innocent ladies going to the bathroom. You, notice anything like that?
Well, damn, Sheriff. I think this might be the very man right here.
This nice fella? No, couldn't be. I mean, could it, sir? A nice little man like yourself?
The man didn't answer, only continued trying to wrench his leg out of the bowl. By the depths of it, he must have had his foot jammed right up in the gooseneck.
That's him, all right, peeping son of a bitch.
A lady came out the front door of the trailer, clad in a cut-off Brittany Fox concert tee and hot pants. Dingle took off his hat.
I was leaning over to put a suppository in, and I seen this creep peeping in the window.
At the sound of her anger, the man intensified his efforts to get loose. A few tomatoes fell off the vine and rolled in the gravel.
Now, you're sure it was this man right here? Couldn't have been someone else who looked just like him?
That's him, all right, goddamn peeping Injun. And look what he's done to my garden.
Now,
Ball said.
Easy enough misstep when it's so dark outside.
He was a peeping in my window, standing on the toilet there just to get up high enough. See? This is my bathroom right here.
The gal pointed at the window just above the toilet tank. Ball took out his flashlight and shone it through the glass. He wrinkled his mustache.
Well, you're certainly right about that. That there is indeed the bathroom. What do you make of that, Dingle?
The deputy still clutched his hat to his chest. He was regarding the angry woman with grave empathy.
Dingle?
Well, yes, Sheriff. I'd say this very lovely young lady was victimized. Caught this fella red-handed. And if I didn't have so much respect for the system of law and order, I'd shoot him my damn self.
A pause. Ball raised an eyebrow.
Peeping son of a bitch.
The gal said.
Give me your gun there, and I'll do it myself.
The Indian was thrashing wildly now.
Now,
Ball said.
Let's not make any rash decisions before we decide just how 1070 the situation is. So, what's your name there, character?
He lay a hand on the Indian's shoulder, who seemed to freeze at his touch. They met eyes.
My name? Unless you prefer I keep on calling you character.
Our peeping son of a bitch.
The man seemed to understand all at once that he wasn't going anywhere. He let out a great breath and said,
I am Harbison. I am innocent.
The hell he is.
Well, hold on, Mr. Harbison. I'm sure you got a perfectly good explanation why you've been walking through the Royalty Deluxe Mobile Estates at night and got your foot caught in this incidental toilet. All you gotta do is tell us what that is, and I'm sure we can all just put this thing to bed. And no one has to get shot, and I can go have a hot dog and not have any paperwork to do. So why don't we just...
He's a goddamn peeper. All over the park, the girls have been saying someone's skulking around at night. He's a repeat goddamn offender. He saw my bare ass.
Dingle shifted uncomfortably, lowered his hat to his midsection.
I'm sure sorry, ma'am. It's a good thing we came when we did. If it weren't for law and order, heaven knows I'd string him up right where he stands.
I've got a rope right goddamn inside.
Well, come on now. Let him at least explain himself. Hardy, what are you doing out here so late at night?
Hardy looked back and forth between the sheriff and the angry woman.
Looking for spice,
he said.
Looking for spice? As in spices? Yes.
That sounds reasonable,
Dingle said. The gal shot the deputy an angry look. Dingle changed tacks.
Reasonably illegal, that is.
I'll go get the rope, unless you just want to shoot him.
Ma'am?
Ball interrupted.
I understand you're upset about what you believe happened. But say Hardy here was truly looking for spices when he just happened to step accidentally into your garden pot here. I mean, would that really be a killing offense?
Have a look around, Sheriff. Where you suppose he'd find any goddamn spices?
Ball straightened up, pulled out his flashlight and panned slowly over the lot. Gravel. Not so much as a clover peeking out of the gravel. He turned the light on Hardy.
Mister, I'd like to give you the benefit of the doubt, but the more I study things, I've found we're completely surrounded by no spices at all.
Just then, another set of headlights swung into the lot. A black sedan pulled up and a woman dressed in traditional Indian garb got out of the driver's seat.
Oh, dear God in heaven. Why does this happen to me?
Hardy! I knew it! You are peeping again!
I am not peeping. I do not do peeping.
Disregarding everyone else, she hurried to the toilet and swatted them.
You do peep. I know you are doing peeping.
I do not do peeping.
Yes, you do.
She swatted him again.
Always doing peeping.
I am looking for spice.
You are not looking for spice. You do not do cooking.
You do not do cooking anymore. Now I must cook. That is why I am looking.
She turned to the sheriff.
I do cook. He is lying. He is peeping. Bad man. Bastard guy.
I am not bastard guy.
Ball noted Clarissa's knees were knocking together. The look on her face had changed from purely angry to half angry and half something else.
Pository's working,
she said.
Well, goddamn.
Don't you worry, Miss Clarissa. You go right ahead and do your business. We'll just stay right here and make sure this bastard guy stays right where he is.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy. I'm gone.
And with a move more evocative of the Matrix, the gal was back in the trailer, the screen door wobbling in her wake. Dingle's eyes panned the trailer wall as if to follow her inside with X-ray vision. Ball crossed his arms and addressed the enervated Indian woman, still staring daggers at her ensnared hubby.
Well, now that that's settled, let's say we just load Mr. Sindhu into the back of your car and call it a nice evening.
The woman's eyes went wide. Everyone paused.
What's the matter?
Ball said.
I think you might be overlooking a few logisticals, Sheriff.
Well, like what?
He's kind of stuck for one.
Ball re-examined the situation. His stomach grumbled.
You could grab under the tank there, and I'll grab under the bowl. As far as Hardy goes, he can't weigh so much. How much you weigh there, Hardy? $1.25 tops? Figure we'll load you right in the trunk there, and you and your lovely wife here can hash this out at home.
He is criminal. Bastard guy. This is last straw. Must go to jail.
Well, now, Mrs. Sindhu, I understand you're upset about your husband's little foot, but I'm sure there's a good plumber can snake that right out of there. Maybe not this time of night, but you could call one right in the morning.
Foot? I don't care about foot. He is bastard guy. Don't want foot, don't want husband. He is peeping criminal. I want divorce.
Now,
Ball said.
I'm sure he didn't mean all those things about you not cooking. No sense running a beautiful marriage over a...
Ball looked for Dingle to add an encouraging word on the situation, but he was presently preoccupied. And ever diligent deputy, he was on tippy-toe by the bathroom window monitoring the victim's well-being.
Deputy?
Dingle snapped back to attention, holding his hat over his crotch like the lid on some rabid animal trap. Hardy watched him with disdain.
Yeah, Sheriff?
Let's get our friend here loaded in the car.
I told you, I do not want him. Bastard guy.
Why do you keep calling me bastard guy? I am not a bastard guy. I am not peeping.
You are bullshitting again. Shitting bull.
I am not shitting the bull.
I divorced from you. No more. You do cooking yourself.
Hardy held up his hands in supplication. He regarded Ball as if they were the only two reasonable men on the planet. It occurred to Ball that might very well be the case, although he had never known a man with exceptional reasoning to get his foot caught in a toilet while he was peeping in a bathroom window. In any case, as Sheriff of Splittail, this was his great commission, to be supremely reasonable in a world incapable of reasoning itself. And the overarching fact of the matter was this. It didn't stand to reason that arresting Mr. Sindhu tonight would affect the societal good or bad. Like any respectable profession, the best result you could hope for was to get through it without hurting too many people. And hadn't Hardy been operating within those boundaries? Because whether there's an Indian peeping in the window or not, we've all got to take a shit. And who was Hardy but a little black fly perched on the wall, watching your ass 100 times over in its compound eyes, and maybe jerking off just a little? No one worth missing dinner over, Ball reasoned.
Well, listen, ma'am. The way I see it, we've only got two options. We could wait until Ms. Clarissa in there gets done doing her business and see if she wants to press charges, or you can retrieve your husband here and 23 skidoo before any of that becomes necessary. And I'll remind you, Mrs. Sindhu, that even if you intend to divorce this nice man, you are currently married to him, and any damages he may end up on the hook for may also apply to you.
Her eyes went wide at that, quite the desired effect. Ball wasn't sure how accurate the warning had been, but in police work, the end often justifies the means.
Ain't that right, Deputy?
Dingle was pacing by the bathroom window, muffled from within quaintest reverberations. With each, Dingle's head twitched to the window like a watchdog. Hardy eyed him ruefully.
Ain't that right, Deputy?
Dingle turned his head.
Well, certainly, Sheriff. It is a nice night.
Ball shook his head and returned his attention to the scorned woman. She seemed resigned at best, according to his keenest police instincts. But with the three of them alone, discounting Dingle, who was preoccupied at the moment, he wondered if he couldn't offer a little help for the troubled couple while he was at it. He was here to help, after all.
Not to come across so negative, ma'am,
he said.
It ain't really so bad. See, what I'm trying to say is this. Tomorrow's a brand new day. But what's already happened tonight can't be helped, and I guess whatever Mr. Hardy may or may not have done in the past, maybe that can't be helped either. But what good man in this world has no bad in him whatsoever? And that little bit of bad, well, that don't hardly make him all bad, does it? That's why everyone needs a second chance from time to time, because each new day brings a chance for redemption. And tomorrow morning, when the sun casts everything in a new light, when the daisies and the petunias spread their petals to embrace the day, maybe you two can start things over. I say to both of you this very night, when the sun rises anew, it rises on a fresh, new Sindhu household. All transgressions forgot, and by nightfall, you'll both be out hunting spices, together. And I just know you'll do the most delicious cooking, because together, you're greater than the sum of your parts, like two nice petals on a fresh petunia. Ain't that right, Dingle? Ain't they just...
And that was about as far as he got. Dingle, hearing his name, pulled his gaze from Clarissa's bathroom window. His reverie broken, he noticed a lightness in his holster. On the heels of that, they both saw the glint of the .357 leveled at Hardy. His eyes got big.
Now, ma'am,
Ball said. The toilet inside flushed. As if on cue, the gun went off. Mrs. Sindhu's arms flew upward, and likewise did her husband as the round blew off his lower jaw. Strange matter specked the window. Clarissa peeked out from behind it with her eyebrows like a muppet.
Oh, shit!
Said Dingle. He'd dropped his hat, but his erection was quickly subsiding. The crazed woman had held on to the gun and was composing herself for another shot.
Ma'am,
Ball said,
I was just saying some real nice things about you two, and look what you went and did.
Hardy's face was pouring blood, his tongue lolling loosely in absence of his jaw. How he was still conscious, Ball had no idea, but he was. He held up his hands to indicate he'd gotten the message. Dingle stood flattened against the siding as if he'd hoped to camouflage himself there.
I think you made your point, ma'am. Why don't we just...
Another shot, this one sending Hardy's turban into the air.
Bastard. Peeping bastard. No more shitting the bull to me.
Clarissa came out of the screen door and beheld the mess. The toilet, in mid-tip, went over and took Hardy with it. An audible snap as his knee went sideways and left the bone peeking out of his pant leg. He was quiet now. Everyone was. All eyes were on Mrs. Sindhu.
Goddamn,
Clarissa said.
so much for the goddamn tomatoes.
Mrs. Sindhu dropped the .357. Her eyes looked glassy. Ball indicated for Dingle to retrieve the gun. Hardy, Ball noted with the shine of his flashlight, was suitably debrained by the second shot, making the reconciliation he was suggesting very unlikely. But was all lost? Did no truth remain in his words? A glance upward revealed the turban sitting on the end of a branch like a bloodied beehive. It looked strangely at home, like it belonged there somehow. He broke the silence.
Now, Mrs. Sindhu, that wasn't very nice. But then again, I suppose it wasn't really nice what he did either. I guess the question now is,
Dingle retrieved the gun and reholstered it. That done, he pulled the cuffs from his belt and advanced towards the stunned woman.
Whoa, Deputy,
Ball said.
Let's think this out a moment.
Dingle looked back with his eyebrow raised.
Sheriff?
Well, if you really stop to think about it, maybe what she did is more of a justified shooting. I mean, when you really stop and rub your belly and really think on it.
But how so, Sheriff? She lifted my gun when I wasn't looking. And goddamn shot the man. Twice.
Well, she shot a Peeper, that's for sure. Trespassing on this poor young lady's property. For who knows what reason. Could be he intended to rape, maybe murder innocent Clarissa here. Hell, Deputy, Mrs. Sindhu might have saved Miss Clarissa's life for all we know.
Dingle seemed dumbstruck. The formerly crazed woman did too, but in a more comatose kind of way. Shocked, maybe.
Hell,
Ball went on.
She at least saved us a heap of paperwork, didn't she? I mean, we'd have been in the office all night if she hadn't justifiably shot the man like she did. Filling out forms, fetching vegetarian meals.
Justifiable as shit, if you ask me.
Agreed Clarissa.
I'd have shot the fuck my damn self if I had a damn gun. And if I hadn't been so consternated.
Ball nodded and stroked his mustache.
What do you think, Deputy? Sometimes situations just kind of resolve on their own, don't they?
Dingle's face seemed to file through its different stages of understanding. In the end, it landed on something like acquiescence.
Well, maybe they do, Sheriff.
As long as someone resolves my goddamn maters,
Clarissa said. Ball nodded.
Deputy, why don't you help me get this gentleman out of Miss Clarissa's estate there, so we can go ahead and call it an evening?
Dingle eyed the bloody and pulp-skulled Hardy dangling from his porcelain snare, his throat convulsing. Ball preparing for the effort with a series of head, shoulders, knees, and toes.
Goddamn undignified,
he said. The man's state of deceasedness allowed for a fairly easy extraction from the gooseneck. One good tug, and the foot came free. Its corresponding sandals sadly forfeit. Ball and Dingle dropped the dead man in the trunk of the big-ass sedan while Mrs. Sindhu watched stupidly. What remained of the man's brains cascaded into the spare tire cavity. Dingle, whose Adam's apple had been a bobbing the whole way, added to the mess a gut full of barf.
Deputy, have some respect for the dead.
I'm sorry, Sheriff.
With that, Ball lowered the lid, and with the click of the latch, it was case closed. Once Mrs. Sindhu was convinced to part with $20 for Mrs. Clarissa's goddamn tomatoes, Ball led her back to her car. The look on her face was that of a woman whose life had been changed in an instant. Because it had, he reckoned. Because situations like this happened all the time, each one with its corresponding radio code, which made things seem just as simple as that. But things were never just as simple as that. When it came down to it, about the only way you could deal with things was to try not to make them even worse. And with everyone creating all these situations, what good did it do to cause any more damage? No more good than doing nothing at all, at least where getting dinner was concerned. Ball sat Mrs. Sindhu in the driver's seat. Her eyes in the moonlight were white all around the irises.
Will I be punished?
She asked, as if the sheriff himself were God on high, a bearded deity among the clouds, or a floating elephant with 15 arms. Ball was none of those things. In terrestrial terms, he was the high sheriff of Split-tail County. In the grand scheme of things, he was no more than a man nearing the end of his shift. A man completely and utterly without a hot dog. Hardly one to cast judgment, because any way you look at the big picture, whether through the rosy lenses of religion or the bathroom window of some young gal's trailer, things were going the way they were going. All the way of Clarissa's suppository. Ball took a scratch pad from his back pocket, scribbled down a nearby address, and underlined it several times for emphasis. He folded the paper and handed it to her.
Will you be punished?
Ball said.
You damn well may be, but not here. Not today.
A little bird landed next to Hardy's turban, pecked at it a couple of times, and then flew away disinterestedly.
Not at all, Frankie,
Ball said into his radio.
Just a little misunderstanding is all.
Copy that, Unit 1.
It had taken Dingle a minute to rekindle his appetite after the gory scene at the Royalty Deluxe. But how long could a man sit smelling a hot dog before the nitrates of the human spirit killed off the bacteria of an impure world? Not long at all. And besides, having barfed out his previous, Dingle had a hot dog-shaped pit in his stomach no kind of moralism could fill. Out with the old, in with the new. Old transgressions forgot. Old cases closed.
It's like my uncle used to tell me,
Dingle said.
Sometimes a man uses the toilet, other times the toilet uses you.
Words of wisdom,
Ball said.
At least I suppose so.
He drank a fair bit,
Dingle said. The two sat eating their hot dogs, watching the clock run out on their shift. 20 more minutes, and it was back to the station and back home. Not a paper to be filled out. Not a worry in the world. Tomorrow was another day. Second chances, blooming petunias, and the never-ending pursuit of law and order.
Hey, Sheriff, what do you suppose Mrs. Sindhu means to do with the dearly departed?
Well, goddamn,
Ball said.
I nearly forgot.
Ball set down his hot dog and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number and held it to his ear.
Evening, Mr. Laundry. This is Sheriff Ball. Yes, sir. About that favor. Obliged? Well, I'm glad you feel that way. See, a nice young lady'll be popping up in a little while. That's right. Well, I hope those pigs of yours are hungry, Mr. Laundry, 'cause tonight they're eating hearty.
Just over 100 kilometers north of Inverness, Scotland, in the small village of Braemar, on the Berrydale River, lived a Gaelic-speaking people of approximately 800. Raising cattle, farming, and being good neighbors was the village's primary mission statement. Winters remained dark and bitter, but pints were rarely without gripped hands, thirsty gullets, and high spirits. On one such night, a dozen or so frolicking and drunken Braemar folk kept a late hour at the Ox and Yoke pub, an establishment in Braemar that was the pearl of the town. The pub, owned and operated by the most popular Braemar proprietor and primary instigator of Braemar wives' angst, Angus John McDougall, rarely had its guitars and fiddles silenced, and the laughter was perpetual. In the corner of the pub opposite the raging fireplace, Angus kept a piano that was rarely played and mostly used as a spot to lay your empty drinks. Angus saw to it that a doily was placed atop it to prevent any water damage. He bought it in Aberdeen at an auction and felt that it gave the place a bit of style, but residents knew, as did he, that piano had no place in a proper fiddle tune. At least, not here. Isla Gillis, the server, kept the drinks flowing and was on her feet for hours from the opening when dinner service started and the stews filled bellies, and the chips never stopped post-dinner. When Colin Kenworth laid his fiddle down to the booze of the left, he did so with a smile and an apology. This was the dance. This was the routine each night. The music had to cease at some point, and it was always to the yells of resistance of the patrons. But they also knew that this signified their time to get their coats and hats on and head out into the crunchy snow and howling wind. After all, the wives would let them play for a while. Farming and cattle keeping was hard work, and it was a trade-off. They would keep the peace and ensure that they had their nights of pints and repeated Gaelic tales of northern prowess in hunting and iron guts that held their drink like no other. The remaining din was a collective of goodbyes. Stools scraped about the floor, the clanging of dishes and pint glasses collected, and coats being slipped on. A few laughs for the remaining 8 patrons that typically saw to the close of the place, and cutting through the jolly ambience was a shriek that some would claim to have shook the tables and the empty glasses upon them. This unknown noise repeated one more time, seconds after. And this time, it already had won its silence, as to remain as clear as possible. Heads turned to each other with a look of shock and disbelief. "What was that? Does anyone know?" Colin spoke up, being the most sober of the bunch, outside of Isla and Angus. He knew that this was not a trick of the mind, and it was clear to him that this was no sound that he'd ever heard before.
Hey, Jesus, Angus! Is that the McLeod's cattle next door being attacked? Those fucking walls have been growing some big bollocks on them since we started working on the turbines.
Isla shouted. Angus, who had stopped frozen in his nightly closing bar, wiped down. "Jesus, Isla, I don't know," he replied. The patrons stopped. There seemed to be no rush to get out into the night. Gordon Allen Logan, the youngest of the crew, had been working for the past year with his father Glenn on the new wind turbine that one of the big companies had started installing into the countryside. It provided dozens of new jobs for the folks in Braemar and the surrounding villages across the river. They were hardy folks.
"Well, I'm to getting home and fetching my rifle. I'll find out if it's the wolves. We can't lose more livestock,"
Gordon exclaimed. Gordon started moving towards the door. His arm was firmly grabbed by Colin.
"Shrink your bollocks down, lad. Nobody should be getting out there yet. Just wait a second there."
The shriek repeated loudly and with a higher register and tone, and it was followed by the scream of a man. A scream that had as much fear washed over it as you could imagine. This made knees buckle inside the pub. Angus had not seen any of these lads afraid before. Not like this. It was not meant to be obvious, but they were caught off guard. The shriek and the scream ended. It was hard to tell the distance, but it was no more than 300, maybe 200 meters away. It was distant, but none of them had ever heard a man scream that loud. That was pure terror in his heart.
"Christ almighty! What's happening, lads? What was that?"
yelped Danny Christie. Danny was a Northern Irish expat engineer from County Armagh that had moved to Braemar to take up the management of the energy centre being used to monitor the wind turbines.
"It's fucking madness. That would have woken the town. Me boys, I need to get back to the missus. She's alone. I need to get out of this place and back home,"
added David McCullough, part-time guitar player at the pub and manager of the local grocer.
"Wife's alone with the baby, and for sure as Christ she'll be off her tits with this racket. I have to go, lads."
And with that, he grabbed his coat and pushed through the door before anyone could protest or hold him back. The wind forced its heavy whistle into the pub on the door opening. and with a slam, forced by the same wind, Dave was heard running through the snow. The crunching was fast and his panting almost as loud, and after a half a minute, it all faded into the distance. He couldn't be seen for the frost on the dirty stained glass window. Others had the same idea, but were more interested in attempting to decipher the mysterious animal. It was a beast, for certain. Michael Coy, the oldest of the residents, was a long-time resident farmer that spent nearly 8 decades watching Braemar grow into the village it is today, from the thick woods and spacious meadows and rolling hills alongside a rushing river. Back then, it was home to only 28 residents, 6 homesteads, including his own, up on the village's highest point. His father built the home in the early 1900s, and Michael made it a point of pride to take very good care of it, along with the 40 acres of farm surrounding it. He built an adjacent barn for the ox and chickens. The other original residents had passed away many years ago. Michael slumped into his seat, clutching his long tobacco-stained beard. He was staring onto the floor, seemingly distracted and clearly nervous and distraught. He was shaking enough to be noticeable, but not out of sorts to those that knew him. Shaking was a human disorder you accept when you're a man of 78. Danny seemed to have been the only one in the pub that noticed the distress of the elderly man. A distress that was beyond a mere rumbling of nerves.
Michael Coy. By Jesus. You all right, old man?
Danny leaned in and whispered to old Mick Coy. Slowly rotating his wide-open gaze, he moved to meet Danny's concerned face.
I'm fine. Just a bit tired, son. I'll have to be moving on. I may have left the barn door open. That wind is a real bastard tonight. I don't want to risk the livestock freezing overnight if this snap freezes up the generator.
Danny found this explanation to be quite cosmetic. There was something in Coy's voice, the tremble and slow measured words that made it sound a bit made up.
Coy, tell me what's bothering you. It's not the chickens. I know this, boy. You're not one to leave anything open or unprepared.
Danny added. Just then, from just outside the pub, at what must have been just inside no more than 50 meters inside the tree line, a deafening shrill, a high-pitched beastly scream that put everyone into their seat, and some with a bright whimper from a fear unexpected. The lights seemed to have flickered, but from the sudden fright, it could have been a trick of the eye. This time, it was accompanied by a constant panting and a low growl. Whispering as loudly as possible, but with clear intention now that detection is not favorable, Angus asked young Gordon to turn off the light at the front door, while Angus turned off the kitchen light, leaving a lantern burning on the piano. Gordon decided that bolting the door wouldn't hurt either. The latch slid shut, and the group knew that this was something new, something extraordinary, and something terrible and dangerous. The silence filled the pub, if you didn't count the collective din of hard breathing and beating hearts. Angus reached under the bar to the bottom and slid out a rifle that was once used for deer and elk, but found far more practical for the threat of wolves that got too close to the patrons outside in the summer when he had a few tables in front. Michael Coy pulled his wool hat down and covered his eyes. This went unnoticed by no one.
For the love of Jesus, Michael, what's eating you?
Said Colin. The rest vocalized their concern also. Michael was afraid of nothing. Hard as the peak of Ben Nevis and as fearless as a Hebrides bull. He was being devoured by fear now. This was a canary in the coal mine for the lads that watched this pillar become a puddle. Michael pulled up his wool stocking cap to reveal his deep blue bloodshot eyes, awash with a light mist of tears that he wiped as quickly as he could. He took a slow breath and wiped forward on his lap as a distraction reflex. I'm all right, boys. Just had a bit much of the drinking. That tummy is not feeling too good from the fish, he proclaimed.
I'll have you know that Tommy Dillon and Raymond Campbell caught the fish fresh today out of the ice. There's nothing wrong with the fish,
Isla protested. Speak up, old man, Angus said. What's gotten into you? Michael slowly stood up, holding on to the shoulder of Danny Christie and his cane in the other hand. He made a little oof sound and slowly walked towards the bar and leaned into it, his back to the group. A light growl and branches snapping was heard outside from the same distance as before. This turned all heads and made Michael grab a bar stool with his squeezing, white-knuckled hands.
I've heard this before,
Michael said softly, then slowly turning to meet the eyes that had just settled back on him from the direction of the door.
That was a long time ago, maybe 50 years or so, but I know the sound, and it's been imprinted in my brains, boys. Not something I'd soon forget, although I'd give anything to be able to.
Michael continued.
When my father's father broke ground here, for the very home of mine that you've all been to, up on the hill, it's took a grand deal of wood and digging. We cleared out a lot of wood and spooked away a lot of the wildlife. And my grandfather used to tell me that we take the space we need and not a shovelful more. We kept that until my father passed away. After he was buried, we came home, and the first thing that came to mind was to extend the farm, make space for the barn that lies now 40 metres from the house. And being the 25-year-old young man that never really paid much attention to my elders, I declined my father and my grandfather's wishes on not expanding or using more of the highlands to stake my claim on the rest of the land that we owned by deed but did not exploit. I felt that this was my damned lot. I wanted to use it for as much as I could reap from it. So I did, with the help of some hired local boys from nearby Brora that had the tools and carriages that I needed to get the job done.
Michael stared into the door ahead of him and paused. He walked slowly back to his seat on the bench next to Danny and blew some heat into his hands. Not a sound was made from the lads.
I was warned to not take more. I remembered only then, in my 20s, story that my grandfather told me about the beast of Cairn Gorm, he called it. He lived in the caves on the highest point of the Cairn Gorm, somewhere nearly a kilometre up the mount. It terrified me as a child. But even as a cheeky story that I felt was a tale of retributions over overindulgence, it seemed a bit extraordinary, and one that, to me, was clearly crafted within the mind of an old Highland man. It was an old Gaelic tale that was whispered about between the kids and was brought up in fun. The faces of adults turned to scorn in sharp shushes. We kids felt the adults just played the game well.
He continued.
So, I've forgotten that story for 2 decades until the first of my 40 acres were cleared away. Tills came up to cut the soil, while I worked on the large barn that I focused on. That some very peculiar activity started happening. See, I was the only home in the area of a few dozen residents that wasn't happy with the confines of the small home. I wanted more. I wished that I hadn't.
Michael took a sip of the forgotten-about last bit of tenants that wasn't yet collected by Isla. The rest of the folks started to quietly pick up their chairs and get closer to Michael to keep the rest of the tale as covert as possible from any terrible ears outside the pub. Gordon lightly ensured the lock was in place while Angus came from around the bar with his rifle, stoked the fire to make sure it didn't go out in this bitterly cold night.
One night in October, after opening up a bottle of cider that was gifted to us in celebration of the new land development that we completed during the 2 months, my wife and I, we sat at our kitchen table after a lovely dinner, what I don't remember now, and that was when we heard the terrible sound for the first time. This sound.
Michael pointed to the space beyond the pub.
In utter shock, my wife dropped the bottle onto the wooden floor and it bounced around. I remember being angry at the bottle while it rolled. Seems illogical now, but I was focused on the sound. When the bottle had come to a stop at the foot of the wood stove, we could hear loud footsteps and the cracking of large branches. Then, that's when we heard our cow scream. If you hadn't heard a cow scream, then I envy you. This was terror. Pure terror in the animals' voices. We heard them being slaughtered, not 30 yards away. I grabbed my gun, a pocket full of shells, and rushed on my boats and ran outside. I was terrified, but I needed to do something. There was something killing my livestock. I ran to the newly built barn, and the doors had been pried open. The animals' entrails and skin and flesh were strewn across my barn. I could not tell which were pigs, cows, or lamb. All were ripped apart. Then I heard the shriek come from just outside the rear of the barn, followed by a guttural roar. I ran outside. My heart was pounding, and I thought I'd faint from the fear. But to the back of the barn, the shriek again. I saw a massive beast bent over with matted fur, which could only have been from the blood of my animals. Its eyes were shining in the moonlight. It was panting and growling in a low vibration, staring directly at me. It must have been 7 or 8 foot tall. Long ears falling to the side of its head, but with sharp teeth that protruded from its maw down to its chin. Then suddenly, to my left near the house, my wife screamed. She'd been standing on the porch and had noticed this monster. It immediately noticed her and began to speed toward her on all fours. This was no animal I ever seen or knew of its existence. It was fast. It was about to descend upon my wife. Why did you scream, woman?
I had shouted at her in my stress. I raised my shotgun as quickly as I could and landed a shot into its lower back, which sent it rolling across the yard of my house. And I added another to its neck. It sounded a piercing yelp and looked at me with a malice that reduced me to jelly. Then quickly reloaded with the shells from my pocket and shot again, this time missing it entirely. I was shaking. I was physically vibrating. It was down and not moving except for its head, and it was intent on me. While I took aim with my last shell, it roared at me, with its fanged mouth wide open. It was certainly perturbed with the holes I'd put into it. The surprise of that shriek made me drop my gun. My hands were drenched in
sweat, and I was lucky to have landed any shots at all with my shakes and sweat-covered hands. Oh, my wife, she ran inside, and it rose to its feet and took a step towards me as I scrambled for the shotgun on the darkened grassy yard. Then I finally felt it and picked it up. When I looked up, the beast had run off. It was moving fast away from us, and it was emitting yelps of pain and growls of rage. I didn't care. It was gone.
Michael then let out a long sigh, reliving his night those 50-plus years ago, feeling the relief that he felt that night, and then rose his head suddenly to attention and looked towards the door of the pub. He then came back to reality. It was back. Michael knew this. It had obviously killed. That one man, whoever was in the distance, it doesn't matter. For certain they would have known him. He would have been a friend. All of the village were friends. The community ousted no one. Not even Ethel McDonough, the town loudmouth and gossiper, would no one want any harm to come to. But how many more lives were lost this night? Michael continued to an attentive storytelling session of listeners. It came back 3 more times during that month, but seemed to remain a spectator. We heard its growls in the night, and the crashing of the brush, and the branches within the tree line beyond the crops. We had our guns at the ready, and some folks brought me up a new rifle. It was a semi-automatic from Glasgow. I don't think it was really legal. I know what you mean, Danny added. I lived a few years in Belfast, Michael. Remember? And tried to attempt a cheeky, comforting smile. Michael hardly paid it any attention as he continued. We had been told, warned, to leave the land alone. We were told tales of a bogeyman that were laughable at best. But we're told to leave the land alone and take only what was enough for you and your family. I want you to know, I was no being greedy. I wanted to provide food for mine. I was just glad that the beast had disappeared for years after. And that was when I had my daughter Isabel. She was only 5 years old around the time when the area attracted new settlers. They had started to build the town, he explained. But, Michael, you mean your son, Michael Jr.? Mickey Alexander? Your son, he works the docks now in Liverpool, right? You don't have a daughter? Angus interrupted. Please, Angus. Michael hushed Angus with a calming hand gesture. Let me finish. The old man observed the faces around him, with a final glance at the space around the front of the bar, listening. Seems that only Michael could hear the low breathing that accompanied his survey. The damn thing would not give up, Michael insisted. The villagers, they didn't help the situation with the constant build and raising of meadows, woodland, and the river space. I did not blame them. They were not aware. If I had told them, how would they accept this fairy tale when a child of 5 thought it to be pure haver? Gibberish. I asked them during a town meeting. Perhaps they leave some of the natural space for the habitat of the wildlife, so we don't drive away the elk, rabbits and deer. We would need the food, and they also help the fertility of the land for crops. I was voted down. They wanted mills and lumber yards, and needed to pull in the riverbanks for boat passages. This was not going to end well. I hope that mine was not connected to my childhood warning, and this
monstrosity was a one-time occurrence. It was not.
Michael's head bowed. He had trouble catching his breath and coughed twice. This brought about a sound much closer to the pub that sounded like a demonic recognition of an old friend. A low mooing sound, deep and unnatural. The group inside froze and trembled. Angus gripped his rifle and pulled it close to his chest. There was silence for nearly 10 minutes after this. Michael wanted to hurry back to his final bit of the story. His cautionary tale that was past caution.
The wind turbines. The town had grown so much back then, in such a short time, remain unmoved for so long that I had not considered this until I heard this thing tonight. We have just ripped apart untold stretches of land, at least 80 kilometers, to install cabling and those behemoths for the energy of a few Glaswegians. I didn't think about this. It would have been through many villages now to make its way here tonight. I promise you, lives were lost this night. It's not finished. The destruction of the land it surveys creates a seething rage. I'll be honest, I am not sure why it's stalled outside. It is what I tell you. This is beyond doubt. The question is if we will survive as I did that night long ago. My daughter did not. It took her away from me.
Michael lamented, glossy-eyed.
After the town had been built up, there were dances and fiddles blaring, and the newly erected halls were alit with merry and cheer. It made its way to us. It was always in the dark of night, never in the day. It came to us while the town was asleep. Screams rang out across the village as it tore from home to home. Some homes were smashed into. We lost 6 of our folk. When it came to me, I first heard it outside, howling. I heard the claws raking across the trees. It wanted my attention. It knew what it was. I know that it remembered me. My wife peeked outside, and I begged her to hold her stress. We could not risk the beast getting inside. We turned off the lights. It wanted revenge, I have no doubt. Not just for the raping of the land, but for the wounding of it years before. I believe that the reason it held back was also because I believe that it had some small measure of fear which caused its hesitation. My little girl woke and began screaming. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight and ran outside to make some attempt to take this thing on. Whether I was killed or not, it would not get my family. I got to the front porch. There it was, staring into my little girl's bedroom. It was as massive as I remembered. I screamed at it in such a rage that I frightened myself. I was ready to wrestle it to the ground if I had to. I shot at it again. It shrieked at me and slammed its claws at the house as the bullet hit. This time, the shoulder. It seemed to make it more enraged.
Michael grit his teeth and spit out the next sentence with tears.
It smashed my little Isabella's window. The window exploded and it rushed into the room while I scrambled after it, screaming, crying, wailing, while my wife screamed behind me and raced behind me, falling into the mud at the bottom of the steps. I got to the window in less than a second, it felt. beast had my daughter in its claws.
Michael paused, wiped a tear. Another sip from a now empty pint. Danny handed him his for that final sip. Gordon and Colin placed arms around Michael Coy while he finished his tale. There was blood covering its right arm as it spread a wide-fanged grin across its face. This thing was a mass of rage-filled instinct. I knew, but at this moment, it was personal. I knew this. I pointed my gun at it. And because Isabel was small, I knew I could get its leg or foot to disable it for a moment to reach Isabel. I raised the gun, and immediately it let out a scream as it stretched its head towards me to focus its anger towards me. My wife and daughter screamed in unison while I fired. I barely grazed its leg. It didn't even flinch. It rushed towards me while I raised my Enfield for another shot, and it knocked me to the ground, sent my rifle flying. It flew off into the forest. I could hear the screams of my little Isabel fading into the distance. I gave chase as long as my legs could. I heard nothing. I was beaten down by branches in my face and roots tripping me up in the pitch dark. I lay in the bog, wailing uncontrollably, screaming for my little girl, for hours until I had to get back to my wife. That was beyond comfort. We spent years in the haze. We could not stop considering the hundreds of different versions of Isabel's fate. It plagued us. 7 years later, Mary got pregnant with Michael Alexander. We put up a large fence, but we vowed to stay and not give up our land. I've added to my gun collection, and we raised Michael without incident for the rest of our lives, until now. Michael concluded. The lads were all tear-filled, and with heads bowed, they felt Michael's pain. Isla, head in hands, wept quietly near the fire with her back to the rest. Fuck's sake, Michael. I'm sorry, lad. I didn't know, Angus declared. Colin, Danny, Angus, Isla, Gordon, and the other boys, Arthur and Dennis, brothers who patroned the pub every Saturday evening, looked at each other and asked Michael what could be done and what are we expecting. We must make a stand. We cannot let this get any further. We cannot let it take any more innocent lives, Michael asserted. What weapons do you have, Angus? I have a pistol in the drawer of the desk in back, and this here rifle. I have some knives in the little kitchen in the back if they're any use, but I can't imagine you get close enough to use by your account, Angus replied. The group each took whatever they could. Michael refused a weapon, while Danny took the pistol and various items. Knives, a cricket bat, a fire poker, and a snow shovel were grabbed up. They moved towards the front. The low breathing was not far from them, on the other side of that paint-chipped, 3-inch thick cedar door. The lads tried to get a peek again through the stained glass window, but could see nothing. Danny took a deep breath, paused, and slowly unbolted the door and gripped its handle. There was a paralyzing fear amongst the group at what they would see, and less of what it could do. The door creaked open. Angus and the others had never heard that creak before. The pub was usually full of life and song and laughter, that this unwelcome noise had not existed. The door slowly fulfilled its action to bring in bluster of wind and light snow. The snow in front of them was illuminated white and shining from the one light that positioned itself at the start of the lane that had guided so many staggering souls back to their safe and warm beds. There was nothing outside but the blackness of a tree line and the last embedded steps of David's rush home. David never made it home, it was later learned, found in a ditch off the path, less than 150 meters from the pub. The group scanned the perimeter and listened. Nothing. Then, a low growl attracted their attention in a cumulative snap of heads towards the left of the tree line. Near Angus's bobcat tractor used for snow removal. There it was. Eyes alight, nearly 8 foot tall, staring at its prey. Its eyes projected a sense of determination. They stood paralyzed. They gripped their weapons, white-knuckled, all. Angus raised his rifle, waiting for a shot. Danny was first. Danny, a cracked shot, fired his pistol at it, aiming it straight into the head. With the precision of an IRA soldier. A former life that was extinguished and escaped from. The beast howled into the sky and clutched at its eye where the bullet seemed to hit. Then Angus fired and hit the snowplow window. "Ah, fuck!" he shouted. Even during this, he momentarily realized that he had smashed his own window. Then fired another and hit its chest, while Danny pushed forward through the snow, pistol at eye level, firing every last bullet into the beast while it attempted to run. Courage found itself in the team as they all pushed forward, knowing that Danny had provided an advantage. They got close to it. Michael stayed back at the pub door. He watched. He wanted his revenge, but he knew that his old legs would not be able to catch up. A female voice came from behind Michael, in the empty pub. Michael gasped and spun around. This little voice was etched in his memory, and it would be if he lived to be 5,000 years old. Tears gushed from his eyes, and he peered across the pub. Nothing. There was nothing. He fell to his old knees, sobbing. He needed closure. This was, certainly, his past begging for him to make amends somehow. He rose up, he moved outside to the group that had surrounded the wounded beast. It was on its haunches, covering its head. Danny had pointed his final bullet towards its head and was ready to pull the trigger, when Michael, who appeared behind him quietly, placed a frail hand on Danny's and took the pistol. The beast then uncovered itself and looked directly into the eyes of old Michael Coy. Ancient enemies. A lifetime journey of hell steered by this fur-clad nightmare. It grinned with that same wide-fanged mouth. Its mouth was covered in blood from its night of savage brutality. Many Isabels were cut down this evening. The beast gave out a final shriek, and a sudden swipe of its claw took off Michael's arm, but not before the final blast. Blood filled the air as Michael Coy's arm flew across the sky. It was hard to distinguish between the shriek of the beast, the gunshot, and the scream from old Michael Coy. The beast collapsed to the ground. A fountain of blood gushed from its head, while Michael lay in the snow, filling it with blood, while Danny and Angus grabbed him and began to pull him back towards the pub. dragging Michael, leaving a trail of blood across the snow. The rest of the group screamed and stabbed and beat the flailing demonic creature until it was nothing more than a hair-covered mass in the snow. The group made its stand at the behest of Michael Coy. Michael got his revenge, but at the price of his life. The old man lay bleeding to death. Bar cloths and coats held the blood to a minimum, but it couldn't be stopped. Michael offered the group a last look and a vague, weak smile, and looked up, imagining his lovely wife Mary and daughter Isabel before he joined them. The group then burned the beast and dumped the remains into the river using Angus's bobcat plow. The following weeks, there were stories of what the villagers had seen. The pub group had made a promise to leave the story alone, to keep it to themselves forever. It would do no good to cause a furor, and also risk being ostracized as drunken fools with wild imaginations. Michael was said to have been attacked by wolves on his way home. An old man that was easy prey for the scavenging packs that had been pushed into the village due to the overextension of the land development. 4 years after the night's deadly occurrences, the Scottish government had decided to bring investment to Braemar and to the villages of Aberdeenshire and provide new jobs with a large-scale highway project. There would be a new council highway moving through the north. The new mayor of Braemar had brokered this deal and was proud to be leading this new development. The villagers that knew the truth, including Danny, Angus, Isla, Colin, Gordon, Arthur, and Dennis, were not against it. They knew that their bogeyman had been dealt with, and this was a welcome new chapter for the area. As long as the village kept its community, there was no objection. 6 months into the rapidly moving infrastructure project, 160 kilometers of forest were raised, and rivers were bridged, and Aberdeenshire was hardly recognized anymore. This would make for easier access to the larger towns and cities for supplies and medical visits. Over 200 new jobs were created for the project, and it would last another 3 years, it was projected. It was at the end of this 6 months that there were shrieks across the countryside. High-pitched shrieks. This was soon followed by the loss of many project workers, then children, then sightings of many half-human monstrosities with fangs and claws, moving very fast across fields and wood. Some claim to have seen 4 at once, moving quickly across the land, and some seen feeding on livestock. The beast had been given a family. The slaughter was far-reaching, merciless, and quick. Their directives were instinctive, and none were spared.
Stein scrambled out of his room into the living room, and then behind the couch that I was sitting on. I noticed he had something in his hand when he came in, but he's 5 now, and I thought it wouldn't be anything dangerous. I heard him playing and laughing behind me while some soap opera played on.
"Don't move," he said.
That made me curious. I just wanted to see what he was playing with. I leaned over the back of the sofa, and he was sitting there with something white in his hand. It took me a moment to understand what was in front of him on the carpet. There were the bones of a complete human leg, and that he was just putting the last toe in place.
"Get away from that!"
I don't remember what I screamed, but I grabbed his arm and pulled him away. The police came soon after, and they searched his room. They had an expert come in, and he said that it was real bone, likely from a child. Later, they brought a search dog. Stein didn't want to say where he found the bones. I promised sweets. I promised a trip to the zoo. The officers even offered him a ride-along in a real police car and that he could use the siren. When my husband came home, he threatened that Stein couldn't get any more sweets until he would tell. That wasn't any more effective. It just made him cry. Every time we asked, Stein kept saying that he couldn't tell. And whenever we asked why he couldn't tell, he just pressed his lips together and shook his head. I was sure that he had come from his room. The police took his room apart, then the rest of the apartment. Even the dog found nothing. Stein cried a lot that evening, even after the police left. He said he didn't understand why everyone was so mean to him, and why the police were hurting his furniture, that he was just helping Nola. I'm not sure if he didn't want to say who Nola was, or if he himself really didn't know. The police said we could stay, but that we should probably keep Stein with us and not allow him to enter his room. Not as if I would have done that. Stein was between us, cuddled up against me with his father's arm on top of both of us. George and Stein were both fast asleep, but I remember staring at them for hours. It felt like a waking nightmare, but at some point I must have drifted off. George's shouting woke me up. George shouting, and then Stein crying. When I sat up, Stein was just pressing his body against the bedroom wall near the foot of our bed. George pulled Stein away. "Where did you get those?" George screamed. The panic in George's face was even greater than the panic in Stein's face. The door was open. We had definitely locked it. And on the floor, right between our bed and the wall, were another leg and a hip bone, and the lower vertebra of a spine. George shouted at me to watch Stein and call the police. He threw Stein into my arms, and he ran into the living room. I saw him check the front door. Then he returned and ran into Stein's room. Stein cried next to me. I just looked at the bones on the floor. They were so perfectly arranged, the way you would see a skeleton in a museum. It took a while before I managed to finally grab my mobile, pull Stein close, and dial the number. George found the front door and all the windows locked. He even checked whether somebody might have gotten in through the former fireplace. But he found Stein's room open. We had definitely locked that too. Open, just like the bedroom door, but not broken into. Just unlocked. The only key we have for those doors, the one that fits all the internal doors, was still in George's nightstand. George said he woke up because Stein was giggling and talking to himself. So he got up, walked around the bed, and there he was, arranging the bones. Stein is usually happy and very open to friendly adults, but he was scared of the police. He didn't want to be in the same room as the officers. They organized a child psychologist, a young woman dressed in normal clothes. She offered Stein sweets and a book. She was very nice to him. But the whole time she was there, Stein just tried to hide behind my legs and screamed whenever she got too close. We wanted to go to a hotel, but the upstairs neighbors were awake and took us in for the night. When the police finally left us alone and the neighbors had retreated to their bedroom, Stein spoke again. He said that the police are bad people, that they hurt Nola very much and stole her leg. Still, when we asked questions about Nola or the bones, he just shook his head. Stein fell asleep on the neighbor's armchair. We decided that at least one of us should keep watch for the remainder of the night. I told George to nap first. He always gets grim and grumpy when he's tired. Then I couldn't get myself to wake him, and I just stayed awake until morning. For those 3 hours, I sat and watched Stein. There was nothing specific to watch, just his calm breathing and the occasional smile that hushed over his lips, until he turned so that I couldn't see his face. Despite all the commotion, I felt warm and relaxed seeing him like that. At 7, the neighbors got up. I heard their alarm, a muffled conversation, then they disappeared in the bathroom. At around 7:30, they came into the living room, and George too woke up. George went to the bathroom. The neighbors asked me whether we were hungry. I was numb from the tiredness and was craving more for coffee than food. I went to the kitchen to help. It cannot have been more than 5 minutes. I walked back into the living room with the plates in my hand. I saw the empty armchair and looked around the room. I called for Stein, and nearly in the same moment I saw the open front door. The plates nearly fell on the table. Our apartment door was open. I heard Stein speaking to someone. Then I made the turn, and he sat there on the living room floor with a heap of bones. I grabbed his arms to pull him away, but he screamed and fought back, and when I kept pulling, he bit my arm. I screamed and pulled back, and within a fraction of a second, he had turned back to the bones, to arranging them. He was so incredibly quick. He just picked a bone from the heap, and within a moment, it was on the floor, in the right place, and another bone in his hand. Not 10 seconds, and he had nearly arranged a whole hand. Then I finally managed to pull him away, even as he was screaming and trying to wiggle free or bite. George came running in, grabbed Stein from my hands, and carried him out of the room. Stein was still screaming and howling out in the corridor, and on the floor right in front of me, next to the heap and already arranged, were vertebra, ribs, and a few bones from both arms, and a nearly completed hand. I think, if not for the neighbor's testimony, the police wouldn't have believed us a single word. The officers searched our place a 3rd time, even with a new dog, and again they found nothing. At least a dozen officers were going in and out of the apartment, but this time Stein didn't want to hide. Instead, he wanted to pat the dog. He was with us on the corridor, running his hands through the dog's fur, while we were talking to an officer about how to proceed. I looked at the officer's face. A moment later, I turned back around, and Stein was gone. There were a lot of people searching him and shouting his name. The dog was running wild through the apartment. I was pure, shivering panic, running in and out of Stein's room. I was in the living room. It was just a flash, a moment between all the noise, that I heard his voice. His giggling. I screamed, "Quiet!" and everybody stopped in their tracks. Even the dog obeyed. And there he was again, giggling. Then he spoke. His voice was faint, as if from far away.
"Don't worry, Nola. They won't find us here."
Within a few minutes, they had ripped open the fireplace, only to find nothing. George was holding me, but seeing the bare pipe and stones down there made my chest clench together. George stopped breathing too. Then there he was again, giggling, louder than before. I called his name.
"Oh no,"
he whispered.
"Mom found us."
The dog's head twitched. In that moment, I knew. I told them to break through the floor, right in front of the chimney. Within a few minutes, they broke through a layer of wood and stone, right into an empty space, a tight tunnel. After that, we heard him coughing. I called him again.
"I'm not finished playing,"
he said. George told him that he would have to come out, that we were waiting for him. And a minute later, he came crawling through the tunnel. He was carrying a skull that he carefully set down. We hugged him. After a few moments, he shook himself free. Then he went to pet the dog. They didn't find much else down there. The tunnel ended abruptly at the end of the house, and at the end were a few more small bones from the same body and some of Stein's toys. We still don't know how he got down there. He always just said that Nola let him in. My husband thinks that's crazy, that there must have been a hidden entrance somewhere. But I know Stein isn't lying. Because the others didn't hear when Stein whispered, "Oh no, Mom found us." And a girl's voice replied,
"Don't worry. They never look down here."
So, ultimately we learn that the hip bone is connected to the thigh bone, is connected to the leg bone, is connected to one damned creepy little ankle biter. Children are such gifts of ghoulishness and surprisingly low calorie when prepared just right. And now for our next stop in our realm of horrors. For our final story of this episode, we meet a girl who is growing up in dire poverty in a bygone era. But she does this from behind the walls of an extravagant mansion. There is a legacy of refinement that her generation of the family has never tasted. But her lifestyle malaise is interrupted by a voice ringing in her head. And that voice has an offer that will be very tempting for her, but disastrous for everyone that surrounds her. Ashley Totho performs for us Chilling Tales for Dark Nights Writing Contest winner Megan Meehan's Genu.
The estate was opulent, a palace among mere mansions. Yet to Chelsea Blackbourne, it was a miserable prison of boredom and routine. Grand, yet familiar, and familiarity bred contempt. The manor was evidence of the great wealth and privilege that had once belonged to the Blackbourne family, a lifestyle Chelsea had never known. It had been nearly a century since the clan had been truly prominent. Even Chelsea's father had not experienced the majestic heyday of the family legacy. Unlike their ancestors, they had never been invited to balls or galas. They existed in the shadows of excess, devoid of the pleasures of extravagance that the house portrayed. It had high ceilings and winding staircases, thick stone walls and grand fireplaces, dozens of rooms and quarters for servants, spaces that were now empty. The manor's decor was aging, yet lavish, which enabled the house to maintain its dignity despite its present owner's problematic financial circumstances. Chelsea roamed the halls, covered by lush Persian carpets and lit by glass chandeliers that glowed golden. There were dozens of oil paintings, mostly portraits of well-dressed and long-dead relatives, and intricately carved wooden furniture that would last for centuries. There had once been considerable quantities of jewelry, silverware, and porcelain, but the majority had been sold over the past 50 years. Now all the remaining treasures were in the attic, a place Chelsea was barred from, but infiltrated whenever she could. Chelsea's father, Henry, inherited the mansion and the acres of land it stood upon from his Uncle George. George, an eccentric bachelor, had lived his life in the lap of luxury, and spent his fortune traveling to far-off locations like Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, where he had amassed various artifacts. Uncle George, a private person, built a huge stone wall around the grounds and ensured that there was only one entrance into the premises, which was guarded by a wrought iron gate painted the darkest shade of black. Throughout his life, he embarked on his own adventures and shirked all traditional rules. Chelsea had never met her Uncle George. He died before her parents were married, but she assumed that he had been completely bonkers. To his credit, he hadn't been responsible for any of the terrible investments that had ultimately bankrupted the Blackbournes. In fact, Uncle George had been quite the businessman. He created a business out of his assorted oddities collection by opening and operating an antique shop in the city's downtown. Of course, most downtown dwellers couldn't afford to buy anything, so George changed tactics. He turned the shop into a curiosities museum and charged the public admission to enter. When George passed away, he had left all his worldly goods to his favorite nephew, Henry. Henry had been cared for by George since the age of 16, after his father committed suicide and his mother had a nervous breakdown. Insanity, Chelsea noted, plagued all the Blackbourne women. Even her mother Agatha, who had married into the family, hadn't been quite right. Apparently, mental instability attracted Blackbourne men. Motherhood hadn't suited Agatha. The scarce memories Chelsea had of her were not fond ones. When Chelsea was 3, Agatha had fallen off the roof, to her death. At least, that was what Henry said. Now older and wiser at age 11, Chelsea strongly suspected that her mother had purposefully thrown herself down, wishing to die. Agatha's death had turned Henry cold and standoffish. Chelsea, meanwhile, hadn't been dismayed. They hadn't liked each other, and so she had no reason to mourn her mother's passing. Since then, Chelsea spent her days confined to the house or languishing in its sizable gardens, as her father locked himself in the study. Her only company was her tutor, Miss Iverson, and Sarah, the wretched maid. Chelsea utterly disliked dowdy old Miss Iverson, who constantly pestered her to polish her pianist skills, but she outright hated beautiful, perfect Sarah. While Miss Iverson was only the latest in a string of tutors, few lasted long with Chelsea. Sarah had been a near constant presence and enemy for over 4 years. Sarah worked at the estate 3 days a week, and as much as Chelsea tried to ignore her, there was something about the servant that captivated and enraged her. Sarah was 19 and much prettier than Chelsea, which seemed woefully unjust considering that she was also much poorer than Chelsea. In spite of how far the Blackbournes had fallen in high society circles, they were still undeniably privileged. Utterly unlike Sarah, who toiled away as a maid for 3 different households 6 days a week. Once, Chelsea asked where she lived, and the maid confessed to residing in a small row house, cramped with several younger siblings and a sickly mother. Sarah was a pitiful creature burdened with a difficult life. The sole advantage she held over Chelsea was her looks. Sarah was undeniably beautiful, and Chelsea was indescribably jealous. Chelsea had first noticed her unfortunate features at age 10. Prior to that, she hadn't thought much about her pudgy belly, frizzy hair, and buck teeth. She rarely registered her broad nose, too far apart eyes, and dull brown hair, until one day she looked in the mirror and realized that she didn't look anything like the fairies illustrated in her storybooks. Fairies were dainty and delicate. Stubby Chelsea resembled the depictions of witches. Sarah, however, was tall and slim, with long blonde hair and bright blue eyes, the incarnation of loveliness. One day, Chelsea had been in town with her father on a rare outing to the curiosity shop and heard a group of young men whistling and shouting. Several stable boys were desperately vying for the attention of Sarah as she hurried down the street, wicker basket in hand, obviously on an errand. The sight had filled Chelsea with envy. She knew she was too young to be courted, but one day she would be expected to marry. But how was she to marry when she didn't look like Sarah? Moreover, why should some common Sarah be graced with good looks when she, a Blackborn, was not? It was simply unacceptable. Sarah hadn't as much as glanced in the boy's direction. Clearly, such attention was too common an occurrence to warrant a reaction. Chelsea had never been fond of Sarah, but her indifference turned to loathing after witnessing that scene. She vowed to punish Sarah for her blessed features and tormented her every chance she got. She switched the labels on the salt and pepper shakers. She threw mud on newly washed sheets as they dried on the line. She hid the broom and misplaced the kettle, and when questioned, denied everything. Sarah started avoiding Chelsea, a fact that elated the younger girl and filled her with an intoxicating sense of power. Chelsea felt a similar sense of accomplishment every time she frightened off a tutor. She disliked learning and threw wild tantrums whenever anyone tried to make her sit for a lesson. Her father did nothing to quell her, and the tutors dared not strike her. She was still a Blackborn, after all. So they simply left to find greener pastures, or at least more agreeable students. The same thing happened with the nannies. From age 3 to 7, Chelsea had been burdened with several minders whom she successfully sparred with until her father finally stopped hiring them. Miss Iverson was the sole teacher she hadn't managed to banish. The elderly spinster Miss Iverson always looked after Chelsea whenever her father had an appointment. Henry rarely took Chelsea along with him since she acted up relentlessly and had a tendency to make a spectacle of herself at formal events. Chelsea didn't mind staying in Miss Iverson's care since she had diligently studied plants and herbs and knew precisely how to spike the old woman's tea and make her fall into a long, deep slumber. Whenever Miss Iverson drifted off to sleep, Chelsea seized the opportunity to ascend into the attic. She had even taught herself how to pick locks solely for the purpose of exploring it. Chelsea was inexplicably enticed by the attic. It was as if something inside of it called out to her incessantly. She liked its dim light and its musty smell. She liked the sight of cobwebs and dust. Mostly, she was fascinated by the masses of objects stacked on top of each other, all things from Uncle George's collection that had not been selected for display at the curiosity shop. Chelsea thought deeply about the treasures. Who were the original owners? How had Uncle George come to possess them? Unanswerable questions, of course, but also divine food for thought. Time drifted idly as she wandered aimlessly among ancient armor and dulled swords, fierce-looking carved masks and oddly fleshy objects in jars filled with yellowed liquids. Chelsea was especially fond of the jars which contained half-formed pigs and eels and cows. One jar even looked as if it held a human baby, although she couldn't imagine how a baby could have possibly ended up in a bottle. She had been rummaging through the attic looking for more jars, or, better yet, papers confirming what they were and where they were from, when she stumbled across the trunk. It was medium-sized, upholstered with aging brown leather, fastened with brass-buckled like locks. It was an unremarkable thing that Chelsea would normally cast aside without a second glance. But something about the trunk pulled her toward it magnetically. She crept closer, unable to take her eyes off it. On a whim, she reached out and touched the lid. As soon as her palm connected with its surface, an odd, dizzying feeling came over her, as if she was being lifted out of her body. while another presence entered her head. Chelsea was aware that the voice was in her mind, but somehow it also seemed to be emanating from inside the trunk. Her sudden intense urge to carry the trunk down 3 flights of stairs and into the garden seemed ludicrous considering that it was nearly as big as she was. Yet, apparently, the chest was lightweight, because the next thing Chelsea knew, she was sitting on the garden's lush, overgrown grass, under her beloved hemlock trees, fiddling with the trunk's locks. Strangely, she had no memory of actually carrying it downstairs, or of leaving the attic. The final lock came undone with a snap, and Chelsea eagerly lifted the lid. She was instantly overcome by a thick, grayish-white cloud. At first she thought it was dust or smoke, but it had a strangely intoxicating aroma that was both timeless and exotic. It was like no other scent she had ever known. Then, with a sound somewhere between a gasp and a yawn, a lithe creature arose from the confines of the trunk. Its body was white, yet vapid, like a ghost, although it better resembled an insect than a human. It had long, spindly limbs, arms, legs, fingers, and large black eyes. Its nose was non-existent, its mouth merely a small straight line near the bottom of its oval head. It had no hair or clothes. Its gender was indeterminable. Chelsea stumbled backwards, but excitement quickly overcame her initial fear. She had read books about these creatures before, and although they traditionally emerged from sealed, fancy bottles, it could only be one thing: a genie. "You've got to grant me 3 wishes," Chelsea shouted at the creature. "I'm entitled to 3 wishes." The creature cocked its head to the side, examining her. "I said," Chelsea continued, but then the being spoke.
"I heard you, small one. But I do not understand why you want only 3 wishes. You could have so much more."
Chelsea's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" she inquired. The creature stretched.
"You freed me. I've been in there for ages. I must show my gratitude."
"Good. I want a new music box, a gold one inlaid with diamonds and pearls."
"But that's not what you truly desire, now is it?"
the creature challenged. "Of course it is," Chelsea spat. "I wouldn't have asked for it otherwise."
Material things may be pretty, but getting your way is so much more satisfying. Don't you think?
Crooned the creature.
"I specialize in fate. If you want something to happen, I can assist you."
Chelsea stared at the creature wordlessly, intrigued.
"If you let me live in your lush garden, I can help you with all your problems,"
the creature explained.
"My advice is golden, and my magic is potent. I can help you with all that ails you, but my presence must be our secret. You wouldn't want to share my attentions. Now would you?
Chelsea vigorously shook her head.
My remaining request is that you bring me food. Preferably meat. I don't eat much, but when I'm hungry, I'm ravenous.
Chelsea skeptically considered the offer. Tell me this, she tested. How do I rid myself of my tutor? I'm tired of her, and I want my father to fire her at once. The creature's mouth twisted upwards in a sinister grin.
That's easy,
it replied.
Spread rumors about her. Tarnish her supposedly pristine reputation. Tell your father that she's aging, and she is starting to disclose scandalous little secrets. Perhaps she had an affair, or two, with men, or boys, or maybe even other ladies. That wouldn't be proper at all, now would it?
Chelsea had never thought about spreading nasty untruths regarding Miss Iverson, but it could certainly work. She was aging, and did mumble on and on from time to time. Who's to say that she couldn't have confessed some dark secrets? And what about that horrid maid? Chelsea hissed. She's even worse. Scurrying around, flaunting her beauty, mocking me with her existence. She must be stopped.
If you really want to punish her, take away her beauty,
the creature replied.
Scarring her face will be a fate worse than death. After all, if you make her lose one of her pretty eyes, she'll have to suffer as an invalid for years, decades, forevermore.
How do I do it? Chelsea pleaded, trembling with glee and amused by the creature's cunning ways. She already felt a strong kinship with it than with any human she had ever known.
I'll guide you,
the creature promised.
I aid those who are loyal to me. Have we a pact?
Chelsea did not hesitate to accept the creature's terms. The next thing Chelsea knew, she was back in the attic, sitting on the floor with the trunk in its original position. She didn't remember bringing it upstairs or pushing it back into place. It was as if she had done so in a trance. A sudden wave of sorrow washed over her. It was all nothing more than a daydream. Yet, when Chelsea glanced out the attic window, she was elated to see the oddly elegant creature coiling itself around the branches of the hemlock trees. A dream it was not. Within a week, Miss Iverson was fired. Henry had been horrified by his daughter's accusations of the tutor's unladylike behavior, especially when Chelsea told him about how Miss Iverson had caressed her. Needless to say, the old woman was not provided with a reference. Yet, the ultimate glory came 3 days later, when the hated Sarah was finally permanently marred. Following the creature's advice, Chelsea tightened all the piano strings and partially cut several with a kitchen knife. Then she ordered the maid to dust inside the piano. As soon as Sarah opened the cover, the steel strings popped off and slashed her face. Her screams were music to Chelsea's ears. There had been a lot of blood. Sarah's right eye was completely ruined, and the skin across most of her face was covered with deep gashes that would definitely leave lifelong marks. Sarah had spent weeks in the hospital, stitched up like a rag doll, and never returned to work. Several months after the maiming, Chelsea had spotted Sarah in town walking, with a black veil over her face to conceal her disfigurement. Young men stood on the corner, yet not one whistled, clapped, or called. Chelsea was pleased. Over time, Chelsea learned the creature's name, Janu, and accommodated its feeding requirements. During dinners of chicken or steak, prepared by the new housekeeper, a quiet woman who was neither beautiful nor bothersome, Chelsea saved some morsels and sneaked them out to Janu. Neither her father nor the new maid ever complained, which was good, since anyone who annoyed Chelsea was guaranteed to meet with misfortune. Janu's presence ensured that Chelsea always got whatever she wanted. After feigning trauma from the alleged assault of Miss Iverson, Chelsea convinced her father that she was educated enough for a girl of her status. Without any scheduled activities, Chelsea spent her days learning how to mix potions to rid her of pimples and to straighten her frizzy hair. Janu was quite satisfied in the garden. The creature nested in the darkest portion of shrubbery, hidden away among the hemlock trees and poison ivy, and built an elaborate nest by weaving silky white tendrils together, creating a web, just as spiders did. It was also eating more. When the leftover scraps were no longer enough, Chelsea started capturing birds, squirrels, rabbits, and the occasional stray cat for the creature to dine upon. The massive grounds of the Blackbourne estate were unkempt since the family no longer had the means to afford the gardeners that the property required. Due to the wild and undisturbed conditions of the land, Chelsea was utterly shocked when her father managed to catch a glimpse of Janu one day, several years after its arrival. Henry had been pacing around the grounds, worried about the cost of Curiosity Shop's rent. He got too near to the hemlock trees and spotted Janu slithering around the upper branches. Henry Blackbourne screamed and ran into the house, hysterically ranting about snakes. Chelsea found him in the living room, searching for his old Crimean war sword, fully intending to slay the creature in the trees. She calmed him and accompanied him back to the garden and eventually convinced him that there was nothing there. Yet, Henry remained suspicious and continued searching around the garden. So, Chelsea decided that he had to go. Chelsea fixed him tea laced with cyanide and told the doctors that he had died in his sleep.
Child.
There was no reason to be suspicious. Henry was aging, and financial stresses often weakened older men's hearts. Chelsea, being of legal age, inherited the entire estate. She felt no qualms about what she had done, since she had done it on behalf of Janu. After all, the creature doted on her far more than her father ever had. Once named the proprietor of the estate, Chelsea promptly sold the Curiosity Shop and its remaining items. She fired the housekeeper and lived like a hermit off her dwindling inheritance. She took up gardening zealously, planting additional hemlock and spindly trees, along with deadly flowers such as foxglove, ragwort, oleander, and yellow jessamine. She even started a makeshift greenhouse in an upstairs bedroom, cultivating Venus flytraps and other assorted poisonous vegetation, until the house was surrounded by a prism of colors. Sometimes it seemed like the garden was enchanted, alive. Trees whispered, petals snapped, vines coiled, and roots twisted and pulled. In her spare time, Chelsea explored Uncle George's library. He had collected books about uncommon yet fascinating subjects. Histories of wars and dead languages, medieval medical practices, instructions on potions and spells. One book regarding human escapades with supposedly mythical beings included an illustration that claimed to depict a Middle Eastern knight slaying evil jinn, dark forms of genies, somewhat akin to Jinnu. Below the artwork read the caption, "Imam Ali conquers jinn, unknown artist, 1568. Chelsea paid it no mind. Time ticked by, its rules non-applicable on the Blackbourne property. Chelsea never seemed to age a day over 30. But Jinnu grew bigger and hungrier, and unable to hunt efficiently on its own, depended on Chelsea. She started traveling to the poor side of town at night, frequenting the dingiest pubs and the shabbiest inns to prey on the rabble of society. Initially, she pretended to be a charity worker and tricked working girls, destitute widows, and hapless orphans into following her home, where Jinnu feasted upon them. Authorities never came to the estate asking questions. The poor were seldom missed. During the course of her rare interactions with other people, Chelsea came to the realization that she was no longer the plain, borderline ugly child she had once been. She subsequently learned how to use her beauty to woo men back to the estate. At first, such seductions had been risky, as only the true dregs of society, like men newly released from prison, would accept such an improper offer. However, with each additional trip into town, such propositions were met with increasing ease. Apparently, the decency of the commoners was being eroded at an astounding pace. Chelsea wasn't sure exactly how many times a year Jinnu had to eat. The creature simply got hungry when it got hungry. Gradually, Chelsea learned its meals were extremely infrequent, occurring every few years, perhaps every few decades. She supposed it was possible that a human body could fill Jinnu up for thousands of days, just as a large rat would fill a snake for months. All the clocks on the estate had long since stopped working, and time was a riddle. But indications of change abounded whenever Chelsea ventured into the village. On one trip, she would spy a newly constructed building, and on the next, the same building would be decrepit with age, as if it was still there at all. The fashions changed even more dramatically. Topcoats and corsets turned into casual suits and sequined dresses, then blue jeans and poodle skirts, followed by bright, obnoxious colors that Chelsea heard referred to as tie-dye. That changed to pastels and black leather jackets worn by men and women with enormous hairstyles. Next, men paraded around in baggy pants, and women stuffed themselves into impossibly tight jeans. Chelsea was not a fan of any of these styles, but she made sure to occasionally entice a female victim back to Jinnu's lair, merely to acquire clothing in which to blend into the crowds. Yet, no matter what she wore, her outfits always seemed to be slightly dated each time she exited her estate. Another telling sign of the passing time was the gadgets that the villagers used. The days of horses and carriages had morphed into a world full of cars, radios, and loud blaring boxes called televisions. Most recently, people walked around staring at small rectangles of light that they held in their hands. Sometimes they even spoke to them. Chelsea hadn't the slightest idea what these devices actually did, but they were called phones, and most people seemed quite reliant on them. Although Chelsea shunned most technological advances, on one fairly recent trip, she acquired a brand new Bakelite radio, and she took great pleasure in dancing to the music known as jazz. Of course, every time she switched the radio on, the stations were different, as if the programming changed overnight. What was the value of one night in the mansion to the outside world? A year? A decade? A century? Chelsea couldn't say. She lived to amuse the creature. She sang and danced for it, and in return it kept her young and vital. After years of listening to Janu speak of the sumptuousness of human flesh, Chelsea decided to sample it, and quickly named it her favorite meat. She took to joining Janu in its meals, devouring everything but the bones, which she used to decorate the manor's interior. She was especially fond of human skulls. Eventually, Chelsea was forced to alter her hunting methods. The new world was full of security cameras, and it was no longer easy to quietly obtain victims. Janu knew exactly how to change tactics. The creature convinced Chelsea to start rumors around town about the Blackbourne estate being haunted by the spirits of mentally ill persons. It was a silly, juvenile story, but it was also the stuff of urban legends. Chelsea assumed the fictitious tale would catch on like wildfire, and she was right. Approximately 2 weeks after Chelsea's latest visit to town, which would have been as much as 2 decades in the outside world, 4 teenagers scaled the fence and stormed the garden like Vikings set on pillaging a village. It was a dark, moonless night, and the uninvited guests blindly stumbled through the tall, untamed grass, shouting and giggling and reeking of alcohol. They were all holding their phones, but technology was useless on the Blackbourne estate. The entire group cursed their blank, unresponsive screens. None of them saw Chelsea coming until it was too late. She swept down upon them like a storm, expertly dispatching all of the bodies in seconds before they could so much as scream. Janu and Chelsea both ate well that evening. Chelsea supposed that she would have to purchase a freezer to store excess meat, since she assumed their meals would be coming to them quite regularly in the future. She assumed wrong. Chelsea was entirely unaware of the emergence of social media, and this ignorance proved to be her downfall. 4 teenagers vanishing at the same time raised alarms throughout the village. When the police checked the missing youth's web pages, they discovered that the group had been planning a trip to the long-abandoned Blackbourne estate. Approximately 12 hours after the teens' disappearance, a police search party descended upon the mansion. Chelsea had been asleep in her bed, belly full and satisfied, when she was jolted awake by the sound of the intruders cutting through the locked wrought iron gate. She glanced out her window, saw the flashing lights, and heard several voices speaking in tense tones. Extreme fear immediately seized her. The plebeians were breaking in, perhaps intending to riot or loot. Maybe the world is at war again, Chelsea thought as she ran to the garden. Her panic was palpable as she imagined the villagers' discovery of the array of bones placed throughout her home. Janu was resting, hibernating, in its shroud-like cocoon. which glistened silver against the dark green branches of hemlock. In desperation, Chelsea violently shook the web. Janu awoke, hissing furiously. "Commoners are storming the grounds!" Chelsea wailed. "Too many for me to slay! Protect me!" For several moments, Janu remained still and stared at Chelsea, studying her. Finally, it beckoned her with its long, limber fingers. Chelsea had never entered the creature's nest before, but she eagerly crawled in, surprised to discover that the dwelling was warm and cozy, more like a tent than a web. Chelsea was starting to relax when Janu turned to face her. Its eyes were black and cold and utterly merciless.
"Our pact is resolved,"
it hissed, and promptly attached its gaping mouth to Chelsea's pale neck. Janu knew its survival depended on disguising itself amid the treetops and waiting for the chaos to subside. It summoned all of its energy and moved away from its silky nest, knowing full well that it would be difficult to find such cushy accommodations ever again. All of its human keepers, slaves, eventually faltered and had to be destroyed. But Chelsea had been the cleverest and longest lasting of all its caretakers. Ironic, considering that Janu had initially been disappointed by how young and small she was. It had greatly underestimated the girl. That Chelsea was rotten deep within her core made her rare amongst humans, but indescribably useful to beings of Janu's ilk. The creature knew it would be fortunate to ever master another such host, but it also knew that it needed to start looking. As soon as the humans saw the conditions inside the manor, they were likely to have the building condemned. Remaining in the garden was simply not an option. Janu crept along the tree branches, staying close to the estate walls. It slithered toward the back of the garden, where the overgrown shrubbery was thickest, knowing that it could probably climb over that section of the wall, undetected if need be. Suddenly, Janu heard voices.
I can't imagine what they found.
That place is an enigma.
I'd love to see the garden, though. It's probably the only private property in the county with more plants than mine.
This statement piqued Janu's interest. The creature hailed originally from a land of sand and heat, an abhorrent environment which it had no fond memories of. It much preferred greenery and gardens. Janu peered over the wall and saw a man and a woman. Both were holding cameras and standing beside cars. The trunk of the man's car was ajar. As soon as they looked away from the wall, Janu snatched the opportunity. It hurried over the stone barrier and slunk into the invitingly dark trunk. A few minutes later, the man bid the woman goodbye, placing its camera in the trunk, and shut the lid. He was completely unaware of the presence of Janu, lurking in the back corner. This pleased the creature. It would wait for the man to pop open the trunk. Then, they would make a deal.
Chilling tales for dark nights.